Олега Кошевого, город Калининград.
This is Kaliningrad, and Russia's most powerful fortress in the Baltic is begging for help. The fuel crisis, paralyzing civilian and military life across Russia, has now hit Kaliningrad in full, and this strategic exclave stands on the verge of disaster. In footage shared on social media, the fuel station queues and local complaints are plain to see. The lines stretch block by block, even in this region ringed by NATO territory, and the discontent is growing. Other footage from the ground captures the moment. In small towns, tankers haven't arrived in a week and a half. Even the buses are affected, and vast queues have formed at the stations. Wedged between Poland and Lithuania, this pocket of 1 million people is now waging what looks like a fight for survival, and its governor found the remedy in knocking directly on Putin's door. In this strategic region, Putin spent years using to threaten the West. Putin today struggles to find fuel for his own tanks. And the fact that the administration had to petition the Kremlin for emergency fuel just to keep a population of 1 million, its farmers, its soldiers, its civilians, going lays the gravity bare on its own. Even without a formal state of emergency declared, the crisis has reached a dire level. Indeed, Regional Governor Alexey Besprozvannykh met Putin at the Kremlin on July 2, 2026, and requested priority additional fuel shipments. Putin approved the request. But limits and queues had already brought daily life to a halt. Yet here's the real irony. Ukraine is disabling this fortress bit by bit without firing a single shot, pulling off indirectly what the West failed to do directly for decades. And in this video, we'll show you step by step how drones costing a few $1,000s are turning Putin's pride in the Baltic into a liability. But first, a small request. Independent war and technology analysis like this is increasingly throttled by the algorithm, and this video isn't reaching many of the people who'd want to see it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It takes only a few seconds. When a region's governor goes to the capital to beg for a fix, the matter is far bigger than it looks. Once Kaliningrad's own fuel stocks began to run dry, a request for priority shipments became inevitable, and that pressure sent the governor straight to the Kremlin. In approving the request, Putin didn't stop at fuel. He also promised federal support for airfares and the purchase of new ferries for the public. Yet the package itself is an admission. Needing planes so people can get out, and extra ferries so goods can get in, shows just how tenuously this place is tied to the mainland. And there's a contradiction on top. This same Putin waves off the crisis gripping the country as not critical in public, even belittling Ukraine's refinery strikes as an attempt to cover up battlefield losses. So on one side, a Kremlin saying, no problem. On the other, a governor going to the capital in person to beg for help. If a matter were truly trivial, governors wouldn't come knocking on the Kremlin's door. The first concrete face of this silent siege on Kaliningrad's streets appeared at the pumps. The gasoline and diesel sales limits imposed from June 25, 2026, made the long queues and supply shortages at stations all the more visible. So much so that, by local media, these queues even block buses from passing on the streets, and at some stations, sales stopped entirely. Footage from the ground confirms the picture. In small towns, tankers haven't come in a week and a half. Huge queues form at stations, and a farmer cries out that the price of diesel has shot up to 159 rubles. Station chaos and soaring prices captured back on June 24th show the crisis has been building for weeks. This scene lays Russia's Baltic outpost bare as it wrestles with fuel starvation. Its military bases, civilian life, and logistics backbone all under pressure at once. This collapse isn't a disaster unique to Kaliningrad. It's the sharpest edge of a fuel shortage engulfing all of Russia. Dragging on for months, the shortage grew severe from late May. Nearly every region tied gasoline and diesel to a strict ceiling. The Kremlin's own steps give away the depth of the crisis. First, gasoline and jet fuel exports were banned, then a full ban on diesel exports came to the table. So much so that one of the world's largest energy exporters, out of desperation, allowed its refineries to produce lower-grade fuel and had to buy gasoline from abroad. The country's gasoline output fell by roughly a quarter in a single year. By some analysts, the crisis has spread so far it could bleed into the whole economy, even blocking an interest rate cut. In short, this isn't confined to a few regions. It's a national problem engulfing nearly 2/3 of Russia. And by independent assessments, some of the refineries that were hit may not return to full capacity for months. By some estimates, not until 2027, meaning a long and uncertain stretch lies ahead for Kaliningrad. The region is already the most fragile corner of this picture, because as priority goes to the capital and the big cities, the most distant corner always sits at the back of the line. There's one reason Kaliningrad is living this crisis far harder than the rest: geography. This is Russia's loneliest patch of land, hundreds of kilometers from the mainland, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, a pocket whose land border sits entirely at its neighbor's mercy. Until the Second World War, this was Germany's Königsberg. After the war, it passed to the Soviets and became a fully militarized outpost. Today, the Baltic Fleet's main base, nuclear-capable Iskander missiles, air defense and electronic warfare systems all sit here. On paper, Kaliningrad is Russia's fist in the Baltic. Yet after 2022, that fist was slowly bound. Lithuania and Poland sharply restricted transit. The flow of goods by rail and road grew heavier, and the passage of military material came to a near halt. With no land bridge to the mainland, one option remained: the sea. All resupply comes from the mainland ports on the St. Petersburg side, along a roughly 1,500-kilometer route that runs the length of the Baltic. When a region's electricity, heating, industry and army all hang on a single sea lane, the smallest disruption to that lane is felt at once. That's the real weakness. Not the weapons that make the region strong, but the fuel that keeps those weapons running. And that fuel comes through a single, fragile artery. A quick pause. Liking, a one-word comment, and your subscription directly help this video reach far more people. Because now we come to the crux of it: how Ukraine is cutting that very fragile artery. Putin can no longer hold Kaliningrad. Years ago, this might have sounded like a utopian future to us. However, today, Kaliningrad, which for years was Russia's critical pressure point and power lever in Europe, has now become Putin's most vulnerable point. Ukraine applied history's most sophisticated siege strategies to Russia's strongest points, and is teaching this to the West. And now all the arteries directly and indirectly feeding Kaliningrad are being cut by Ukraine's sophisticated attacks. Because Kaliningrad's geography was making it as fragile as it made it strong, the approximately 1 million civilians living here, the Baltic Fleet garrison, and tens of thousands of soldiers were completely dependent on energy, fuel, and ammunition coming from Baltic waters to survive. The railway transit lines previously operated through Lithuania were largely narrowed by the heavy waves of restrictions applied after 2022. This narrowing pushed the Kremlin leadership into searching for alternatives, turning the 1,500-kilometer sea highway starting from St. Petersburg ports into the sole lifeline. Putin strengthened the maritime line feeding Kaliningrad's military and civilian logistics at full throttle. However, the shocking developments experienced in June 2026 proved with field data just how fragile this supposedly unshakable logistics backbone was. And Ukraine targeted exactly this dependency: the 1,500-kilometer maritime artery feeding this massive garrison, right at its exit point. On June 3rd to 6th, long-range unmanned assault systems belonging to Ukrainian forces struck the Kronstadt shipyard, known as the Baltic Fleet's repair and maintenance heart, with exceptionally rare precision, breaking the weakest link in the chain. 5,000 tons of ammunition were disabled in a single night. The evaporation of a large-scale military cargo within hours means the destruction of hundreds of train wagons worth of ammunition before it reached the front. This massive naval logistics, planned for delivery to Kaliningrad, was dragged into a severe collapse phase by a single accurate strike. This sudden pause in ammunition flow is limiting defense capabilities across a wide spectrum, ranging from radar operators to missile batteries in the region. While the operational space of field units is being largely restricted, it carries the potential for a serious planning chaos to emerge at the command level. The picture before us has long surpassed the dimension of a simple tactical loss that could be explained by a single ammunition depot destruction. A simultaneous ecosystem collapse is being observed where all capillaries feeding the external region are being cut in a coordinated manner. The Russian economy is largely based on a structure dependent on global energy sales. The continuity of these sales is closely tied to civilian commercial activities in the Black Sea basin. The strategic revenues obtained were enabling the financing of Kaliningrad. The creation of a permanent military pressure point over Europe was supported by this revenue flow. However, the civilian trade network sustaining the peninsula has been shaken by a systematic series of operations in recent months. The Black Sea Fleet, positioned on the southern front, has largely melted to the point of losing its operational capabilities. Strategic ports around Crimea have been effectively forced into shutdown status by Ukrainian unmanned naval vessels. The Sea of Azov, a vital transit route for cargo ships, is being held under uninterrupted fire control. All this insecurity on southern routes is elevating the northern Baltic exits to a vital level for Moscow. But Kyiv's forces chose to deliver the truly devastating blow to the refinery infrastructure, the heart of logistics. The Ukrainian army, increasing its operational strike ranges into the mainland's depths, targeted a full 18 critical Russian refineries, stopping their production lines. This severe contraction in oil processing capacity is directly threatening the volume of fuel to be pumped to the Exclave via St. Petersburg. The administration, struggling to stabilize domestic gasoline prices, is rapidly moving away from the logistical luxury of regularly sending fuel ships to a distant overseas garrison. With the expansion of Kyiv's strike license toward Baltic ports, the 1,500-kilometer sea line has ceased to be a safe supply route. This corridor is turning into a high-cost and risky wiped-out zone, open to surprise attack at any moment. Disruptions in military supply lines weakens the garrison's combat power. Vulnerabilities in civilian energy infrastructure directly targets that region's vital signs. In the specific case of Kaliningrad, a vulnerability point far more critical than military ammunition stands out. The electrical grid is the sole fundamental organ ensuring the survival of 1 million people in the region. In February 2025, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania decided to exit the Brel electricity network inherited from the Soviet era. These three countries integrated into the ENTSO system, the European continent's main grid, without losing time. This synchronization change carried a devastating strategic isolation meaning for Kaliningrad. When you look carefully at maps, it becomes clear that power balances on Earth are often tied to millimetric sea passages. A strait, a canal, a narrow passage on a coastline, these are nearly invisible on the map, but invaluable for whoever controls them. On the southeastern coast of the Baltic Sea, there is such a passage, the Strait of Baltiysk, which connects the Vistula lagoon to the open sea and passes through Russia's Kaliningrad territory. This passage was the geographical leverage Russia quietly used for decades, and one of the longest-lasting victims of this leverage was Poland, a NATO member, a European Union member, and one of the continent's fastest-growing economies. For 30 years, Poland had to ask Russia for permission to access its own port. Russia used this advantage. It blocked ships, banned passages, and strangled a city's economy for decades. However, Poland built a canal to bypass Russia. By spending $450 million, it opened a canal from its own territory to the Baltic Sea. What it purchased was not a waterway. It was the ability to say no to Russia. It took 30 years to gain that ability, because geography was working in Russia's favor. In Poland's northeast, there is a lagoon, a strait, and a Russian territory. And at the intersection of these three, a 30-year dependency was born. The Vistula lagoon extends approximately 90 kilometers along Poland's northeastern coast and is separated from the Baltic Sea by a narrow sand strip called the Vistula Spit. The lagoon's only natural outlet to the Baltic was the Strait of Baltiysk at its northeastern end, and that strait belonged to Russia's Kaliningrad region. This meant every Polish ship wanting to reach open sea from the port of Elbląg on the lagoon's shore had to pass through Russian waters. During the Soviet Union era, this was not a problem, but when the Soviets collapsed in 1991 and Kaliningrad became a separate Russian territory, this geographical detail turned into a political vice. The two countries negotiated for years to formalize transit rights, but a permanent agreement could not be reached. The arrangement Poland was able to obtain was fragile. 14 days advance notification to Russian authorities for each ship passage, approval that could be denied at any moment, and a complete ban on foreign vessels from EU member countries. Russia used this advantage to its fullest. Between 2006 and 2010, a complete ban was imposed on passage through the strait. For 4 years, sea access to the port of Elbląg was effectively zeroed. Even after the ban was lifted, transit fees and bureaucratic delays continued as soft pressure. The consequences accumulated over decades. Elbląg was a city founded in 1237 that had served as one of Europe's major trading ports since the Hanseatic League era. But under Russia's geographical vice, cargo traffic fell from 358,000 tons in 2014 to approximately 125,000 tons by 2021. A port city with 7 centuries of trading tradition was strangled over generations by a geographical veto hidden behind a strait. Poland's answer was to bypass that strait and open its own gate from its own territory to the Baltic Sea. But first, a small favor. Independent war and technology analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd want it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that. It takes only a few seconds. The canal cutting through the Vistula Spit began construction in 2019 and was completed in 3 years. Its total length is just 1.3 kilometers, but this 1.3 kilometers cut Poland's 30-year dependency. The canal is approximately 5 meters deep and allows passage for ships up to 100 meters in length. Approximately 12 medium-sized ships can transit per day, too shallow for large cargo ships or warships, but sufficient for the commercial and tourist traffic Elbląg needs. This depth limitation will become important later, because Russia would claim that NATO frigates would pass through this very canal. How the canal works is at least as interesting as its dimensions. The 2 swing bridges on top rotate 90 degrees as ships approach to allow passage, so road traffic continues uninterrupted as well. But the real engineering achievement is the lock system. Its chamber is 270 meters long, 25 meters wide, and approximately 6.5 meters deep. There are 4 steel gates controlling transit, each weighing approximately 160 tons. The cost of all this? Approximately $450 million. $450 million for 1.3 kilometers. Over $340 million per kilometer, one of the most expensive canal constructions in modern European history. But what Poland purchased was not an engineering project. It was sovereignty, manifested as infrastructure. To understand the true value of this sovereignty, it is enough to look at the other side of the strait, at the territory Poland had to ask permission to access for 30 years. Kaliningrad is a piece of territory completely cut off from the Russian mainland, squeezed between Poland to the south and Lithuania to the north, surrounded on all sides by NATO and EU territory. When the Soviets collapsed, Russia held onto this region for a single reason. The Baltic Fleet headquarters is here. And Russia didn't just protect that headquarters, it transformed the region into Europe's most heavily militarized piece of territory, with Iskander ballistic missiles, S-400 air defense batteries, and anti-ship systems. The reason is clear. Approximately 230 kilometers east of Kaliningrad lies NATO's most fragile point, the Suwalki Gap. This gap is only approximately 65 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and is NATO's only land connection to the Baltic states. To the west of the corridor lies Kaliningrad, to the east, Russia's ally, Belarus. Russia could squeeze this corridor from both sides to sever Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania from the rest of NATO. More than 6 million people would become unreachable by land. And Russia is not using Kaliningrad only for conventional military pressure. In 2024, Baltic undersea cables were cut, GPS signals are being systematically jammed in the region, and shadow fleet tankers were found to be carrying intelligence personnel. Kaliningrad has gone far beyond being a naval base. It is the center of all of Russia's pressure operations in the Baltic. The Vistula Canal should be read within this picture. The canal's 5-meter depth is too shallow for warships. No NATO frigate can pass, and Russia knew this. But in a conflict scenario, Poland can now conduct patrol and logistics operations in its own lagoon without entering Kaliningrad waters. The canal's military value is not in passing a large warship, it is in breaking Russia's geographical monopoly. Russia did not silently watch its geographical monopoly being broken. It waged a three-front campaign to stop the canal. The first front was the environmental argument and directly targeted EU institutions. Russian state media published reports claiming the canal would drive local species to extinction. Moscow suddenly announced plans for a national park on the Russian section of the Vistula spit that it had shown no interest in for decades. The aim was to trigger EU-level environmental reviews to delay the project through bureaucratic procedures. The irony is that when construction was completed, the exact opposite happened. The artificial island created from excavation material created nesting areas for coastal birds. Russia had said habitat would be destroyed. Poland built habitat. The second front was the economic argument and targeted Polish public opinion. A Polish university's research calculated that commercial returns would take 650 years to recoup. Russian commentators spread this figure to prove the project was fiscal irresponsibility. Looking solely at commercial figures, the argument had genuine basis. Poland's main ports were already operating efficiently in Gdansk, Gdynia, and Szczecin, and the canal was too shallow for large cargo ships. The third front was the military argument and targeted international public opinion. Russia claimed the canal would give NATO warships access to the lagoon, but this claim could be refuted with a depth chart. The canal's 5-meter depth made the passage of any NATO frigate physically impossible. Russia knew this. The concern was not real, it was theater. Poland's response was to not directly answer any of the three arguments. They classified the canal as civilian infrastructure, quietly completed the EU's environmental review process, and never entered public debate with Russia's military framing. They didn't argue, they built. And when they built it is at least as important as what they built. While Putin dreams of an empire on Ukrainian soil, he has yet to realize that he has lost his real empire at sea. For the Kremlin, the Baltic Sea is not just a body of water, but Russia's economic lifeline. The vast majority of Russian oil, more than 80% of exports, passes through this sea. But today, NATO has its fingers on that lifeline. Scandinavia has launched the greatest strategic encirclement in history. On one side, megatunnels pierce the seabed. On the other, missiles lock onto Moscow. This iron ring effectively imprisons the port of St. Petersburg in an inland lake. To understand this massive encirclement and engineering assault, we must first analyze the silent war unfolding beneath the surface in those dark and cold waters. Threatening undersea fiber optic cables, data lines, and energy pipelines to force the West to the negotiating table through energy and communications blackmail was the Kremlin's new game plan. Russia's ability to physically access and sabotage undersea fiber optic cables in the Baltics set off red alarms at NATO headquarters. However, the Scandinavian capitals, Helsinki and Stockholm, instead of responding to this hybrid war and the constantly escalating tension by simply sending ships or increasing patrols, embarked on an engineering move that would completely change the rules of the game. The Helsinki government put shocking in scale and audacious projects on the table. The goal was to physically connect the Scandinavian peninsula to the European mainland with concrete and steel. At the heart of this plan is a massive railway tunnel project, the Finest Bay area, which would run under the Baltic Sea between Helsinki and Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. This project cannot be viewed as a simple transportation investment or a metro line between two cities. It is a geostrategic move that logistically removes Finland from being an island and integrates it directly into Central Europe's railway network. Once completed, military and commercial cargo loaded in Finland will be able to flow to the heart of Europe without ever surfacing, avoiding the threat of Russian warships or missiles. This is a bypass operation that completely nullifies Russia's naval blockade threat. While Russian ships battle storms on the surface, NATO tanks and ammunition will reach their destination below, at 100 kilometers per hour and in complete safety. The engineering offensive is not limited to this. there is similar activity in the north. The Confederation of Finnish Industries is pushing for a bridge or tunnel line between Sweden and Finland, passing through Turku and the Åland archipelago. This route effectively turns the northern entrance to the Baltic Sea, the Gulf of Bothnia, into an inland lake, reducing Russia's maneuvering space here to zero. The inspiration for these projects comes from the south, the engineering marvel that is the ERASED bridge connecting Denmark and Sweden. With 7.5 million vehicles crossing it and 215 million euros in profits in 2024, this bridge is a monument to success, proving that the model works, and is even a vital logistical artery in times of crisis. Now Finland has even begun feasibility studies for a new link in the north, the Kvarken link, between Umeå and Vasa, along the Gulf of Bothnia. The Kvarken link project is not just an economic corridor, but also a military backup route. In the event of a potential conflict, even if the southern sea lanes are threatened by Russian missiles, NATO could transport ammunition arriving at Norwegian ports to the Finnish front, and from there to the Russian border within minutes via this northern route. Once this network is complete, while Russian ships battle storms and NATO patrols above, the alliance's logistics will flow silently, uninterrupted and untouchable below, within the tunnels. While these tunnel and bridge projects create strategic infrastructure and logistical resilience, the military pincer closes in the middle of the sea, on the Swedish island of Gotland. Dubbed the unsinkable aircraft carrier by military experts, this island stands at the very heart of the Baltic Sea, Russia's worst nightmare, and a stopper blocking its escape routes. The power controlling Gotland becomes the absolute master of air and sea traffic throughout the south and the central Baltic. With Sweden's accession to NATO, the advanced sensors, Patriot air defense systems, and coastal anti-ship missiles on this island have turned the Russian air and sea corridor from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad into a veritable death zone. This means that Stockholm is now the sole decision-maker on what enters and exits Kaliningrad, and even which routes Russian military transport aircraft can take. Russia's most strategic base in the west is now a hostage to Sweden's initiative. However, Russia's nightmare is not just logistical bottlenecks or increased economic costs. It is that the war has now come directly home and threatens its most intimate strategic areas. Look at the map from a broader perspective, through the cool-headed eyes of a general. This iron ring in the Baltic is just the beginning. The Swedish armed forces have clearly stated that they want weapon systems with a range of up to 2,000 kilometers that can strike military facilities and critical infrastructure deep behind enemy lines. This is not a technical detail, but a geopolitical earthquake. Open the map and measure. The distance between Moscow and Stockholm is approximately 1,000 kilometers. In modern warfare technology, this distance means front line, not backyard. When Swedish Defense Minister Paul Johnson says, "We must create a stronger deterrent against this threat," he is actually shouting in diplomatic language, "We will not only defend our borders, if necessary, we will strike Moscow in its bed." This rhetoric fundamentally changes the character of the war and Russia's centuries-old security perception. The Scandinavian buffer zone, which hid behind neutrality throughout the Cold War and posed no threat to Russia, is now positioned like a high-tech spearhead aimed at Russia's heart. The Kremlin's long-standing propaganda of "NATO is approaching our borders," used to consolidate domestic public opinion, has come true like a terrible prophecy as a result of Putin's own aggressive policies. Military headquarters in St. Petersburg, air bases in Novgorod, and strategic missile silos outside Moscow are now within range of NATO's conventional missiles, leaving them unprotected and exposed. We have entered an era where the illusion of a safe zone on Russia's western flank, its strategic depth, has completely vanished. There is now nowhere safe for Russia. The geography of war has reached Moscow's doorstep, and these developments are leading us to a catastrophe far greater than a tactical defeat, a grand strategic encirclement operation. Russia is now completely surrounded by 8 NATO countries in the Baltic Sea. The Kremlin's response to this, re-establishing the Leningrad military district after years, is not a show of strength, but rather an official admission of helplessness, a defensive reflex, and a state of panic. This northern wall, spearheaded by Finland, reduces Russia's strategic depth in the west to zero. Russian military strategists now code the Baltic and Arctic theaters, which they once viewed as separate operational areas, as adjacent and lost areas. The canal idea had been debated for decades, but political momentum was born in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. Eastern Europe's threat assessment fundamentally changed. A straight dependency on a coastline was no longer a theoretical risk, but a concrete security vulnerability. Law and Justice Party chairman Yaroslav Kaczynski, who had advocated this idea for decades, finally obtained the necessary support. Construction began in 2019, and 3 years later, the canal was completed. Poland did not leave the opening date to chance either. September 17, 2022, the day the waterway permanently severing Russia from the coastline was opened, was the anniversary of one of the heaviest pages in Polish history. On September 17, 1939, as Nazi Germany advanced from the west, the Soviet Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border, a coordinated double betrayal that led to 50 years of occupation. Poland chose to open the canal that cut its geographical dependency on Russia on the very anniversary of that invasion. Prime Minister Morawiecki described the canal as severing the last symbolic ties of dependency. When the first ship, Garnia's workboat Zodiac II, passed through the canal, Elbląg had opened to the Baltic without Russia's permission for the first time in 30 years. The next day, 95 ships made the crossing. There is one more layer to the timing. 7 months before the opening, on February 24, 2022, Russia had launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Canal construction had begun in 2019, when most European capitals did not believe a major Russian land war was possible. Poland had already started construction at that date and had guessed correctly. By September 2022, the strategic logic behind every zloty spent had been validated in the harshest way imaginable. But although the canal opened in 2022, it took time to become fully functional. The canal itself was ready, the lock was working, the breakwaters were in place. But on the lagoon side, the last 900-meter section of the Elbląg River was not deep enough for commercial vessels. The canal was open, but the port was still not fully accessible. Now in 2026, that final piece is also being completed. Dredging works are finishing in the second quarter of this year, and commercial vessels will, for the first time, be able to reach the port of Elbląg directly. Tourism facilities have expanded, logistics companies have announced plans to use the port, and for residents who watched the port area gradually empty for decades, change has become visible. Elbląg now opens to the Baltic without needing Russia's permission. Elbląg's story is powerful on its own, but Poland is not the only country breaking this formula. Russia has applied the same strategy in different geographies for decades. Control a bottleneck or transit point, create the other side's dependency, and use that dependency as political leverage. In Poland, it was a strait. In Germany, it was natural gas. In Ukraine, it was a sea passage. In Moldova, it was a transit corridor. The formula was the same everywhere, and now it is breaking everywhere. Germany learned the cost of this formula in 2022. The Nord Stream pipeline had provided Berlin with cheap energy for years while giving Moscow veto power. When Russia turned off the tap, Germany faced one of the heaviest energy crises in its history. Berlin's response was to dismantle the dependency. LNG terminals were built at record speed, and Russia's energy leverage became inoperative within one winter. Russia had tried to control Germany with gas. Germany structurally eliminated that control. At the Kerch Strait, Russia controlled Ukraine's access to the Sea of Azov, holding the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk hostage for years. In 2018, it physically stopped Ukrainian naval vessels at the strait. Ukraine's answer came from the sea. Drones forced the Black Sea Fleet to withdraw from Sevastopol, and the Kerch Strait ceased to be Russia's unilateral control instrument. Finland and Sweden abandoned decades of neutrality and joined NATO. Russia's invasion triggered the very expansion it aimed to deter. And Moldova is developing alternative energy and trade routes to bypass Russian transit dependency over Transnistria. The common thread of these transformations is timing. all of them accelerated after 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine awakened Europe, and every country was forced to confront its own geographical dependency. Poland responded with concrete and steel, Germany with LNG terminals, Finland and Sweden with NATO membership, Ukraine with drones. The tools were different, but the lesson was the same. The only lasting solution against Russia's geographical leverage is to structurally eliminate that leverage. The formula is breaking, but it would be a mistake to underestimate the cards Russia still holds. The canal opened, but Kaliningrad still stands on the other side of the strait, with Iskander missiles, S-400 batteries, and the Baltic Fleet. The Suwalki Gap didn't close because the canal opened. The 65-kilometer corridor is still NATO's most fragile point, and the 2026 wargame simulation showed the alliance could not defend this corridor. Russia's hybrid warfare capacity has not diminished. If anything, it is increasing. Cable sabotage, GPS jamming, and shadow fleet operations are intensifying in the Baltic. Geographical leverage is breaking, but Russia is developing other leverages. And looking at the canal itself, the commercial case is still weak. The 650-year return on investment calculation is real, and ignoring this figure would be an analytical error. Poland's main commercial ports operate efficiently in Gdansk, Gdynia, and Szczecin, and Elbląg will never compete with these ports. When assessed as a commercial investment, the canal is hard to defend. But infrastructure spending has always served purposes beyond commercial returns. Rural railway lines operate at a loss to keep communities connected. Military installations cost billions to deter threats that may never materialize. And no return on investment calculation can answer this question. What would be the cost of the only exit to Elbląg being under Russian control during a war on Russia's doorstep? Poland built the answer before asking the question. Russia used geography as a weapon for 30 years. It controlled bottlenecks, created dependencies, and turned neighboring countries' access into leverage. Poland neutralized that weapon with concrete and steel, and 1.3 kilometers of canal did what 30 years of diplomacy could not. The ability to say no to Russia is no longer behind a strait. It is on Poland's own territory. Putin was so focused on the maps of the 20th century that he lost the greatest treasure of the 21st century. He didn't lose it in Ukraine, he lost it much further north, in the Arctic Ocean. Billions of dollars worth of cargo is currently trapped at sea. According to Bloomberg reports, 23 giant tankers and cargo ships are stuck in the ice, unable to move. Without firing a single shot, Russia's Baltic bridges are being disabled. The steps taken by Moscow in managing the crisis provide important data for us to understand the seriousness of the situation. In a notable move, Russia has directed its valuable strategic assets in the Arctic region, the nuclear icebreakers Sibir and Murmansk, southward in the hope of breaking the deadlock in the Baltic and restoring port operations. Although this rare winter transfer is driven by operational necessity, it demonstrates the difficult choices the state must make in its prioritization. The Northern Sea Route, which Vladimir Putin aims to establish as the new axis of global trade, has been temporarily sidelined in order to resolve the tanker traffic congestion off St. Petersburg. With the withdrawal of nuclear icebreakers from the Arctic, the likelihood of ambitious projects and operational goals in that region being seriously crushed is gaining weight. According to data published by St. Petersburg chief meteorologist Alexander Kolosov, ice formation in the region is expanding at an unprecedented rate, and the affected area is growing by the hour. The severity of the situation has reached such a level that port authorities in Primorsk and Vysotsk were forced to issue strict instructions prohibiting the entry of ships without ice-class certification unless they are accompanied by special icebreakers. Vladimir Putin's massive fleet is trapped in the Baltic Sea. The Gulf of Finland has now turned into a giant parking lot. About 24 Russian ships have been trapped here for weeks. The situation is shockingly dire for Moscow. The Russian Navy had to transfer icebreakers from the Arctic, with the Sibir and Murmansk ships being redirected to the Gulf of Finland. Port authorities could ban all tankers starting March 1st if ice thickness reaches 30 to 50 centimeters, which would mean a complete halt to exports. This restriction has led to the formation of massive ship queues stretching for days near the ports. Only 3 of the 23 tankers currently stranded in the region were able to reach the area last week, but despite the time that has passed, they have not been able to load a single drop of oil. These ships are waiting in the middle of the water, like massive steel coffins that have lost their ability to move. Ship operators are forced to wait for special escort vessels to enter ports, and the waiting time has already increased by 5 to 7 days. Russian shipyards, struggling to survive with infrastructure dating back to the Soviet era, lack the capacity to strengthen the fleet. Due to years of corruption and lack of investment, port facilities have missed opportunities for modernization. Now, the price of this negligence is being paid with an export capacity that has fallen by hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. Oil exports from the Primorsk terminal fell to 490,000 barrels per day in the first half of February. This decline represents a massive drop of 1/3 compared to the previous year and 50% compared to the same period in 2024. This financial bomb, which has landed right in the middle of the war budget, highlights how fragile the country's logistics infrastructure is. Russia is trapped in its own ocean. The shutdown of Russian shipyards triggered a domino effect. The first domino to fall was the Northern Sea Route, NSR. Geographically, this route is revolutionary. Russia's Arctic dream was not just about breaking ice. The real goal was to cut off the lifeline of global trade, namely the Suez and Panama canals. The math was clear and ruthless. The NSR shortens the distance between Asia and Europe by 40% compared to the Suez Canal. The 21,000-kilometer route is reduced to 12,800 kilometers. This meant a 30% savings in fuel costs and a 15-day advantage in delivery time. Furthermore, compared to the Panama Canal, the NSR is 30 to 40% shorter on Europe-Asia-Pacific routes, saving 10 to 15 days and reducing costs by 25 to 30%. For the logistics world, this was the holy grail. Russia's plan was to operate the planet's only safe highway in a world where the Panama Canal was struggling with drought and the Suez Canal was blocked by Houthi missiles. For China, this route was the Polar Silk Road. It was an escape ticket from the American naval blockade in the Strait of Malacca, the instability in Suez, and the high prices in Panama. For Russia, it meant billions of dollars in transit fees per year and a unique geopolitical lever. Vladimir Putin planned to move 80 million tons of cargo through this route by 2024, aiming to rival Panama and Suez. But today, that alternative highway has collapsed. There is a simple rule in shipping: no safety, no trade. An Arctic route without icebreaker escorts is the world's most dangerous gamble. The war economy strained Russia's engine. For every inch of mud gained in the south, an ocean was sacrificed in the north. Russia's $15 trillion potential turned into a $5 trillion loss. To perform an autopsy on this strategic disaster, we must first turn our attention to that small but vital point on the map, the Onega shipyard. This was the production base for Putin's Arctic strategy. However, reports today show that this base has been turned into a graveyard. The cancellation of the Onega shipyard's flagship project, Icebreaker 7, and the shipyard's near bankruptcy triggered systemic necrosis in Russian industry. For years, Kremlin propaganda talked about the invincibility of Russian icebreakers. "We are the masters of the ice," they said. But when the cranes stopped at Onega, that domestic and national lie collapsed. The truth was this: Russia's Arctic vision depended on a life support system that was 80% reliant on Western technology. The massive propellers that enabled those ships to break through the ice? French engineering. The engines that powered those ships? Made in Finland. Navigation, radar, sensors? All from the West. When the war in Ukraine began, the West pulled the plug. The French didn't supply the propellers, the Finns didn't supply the engines. Russian engineers were left alone in those cold hangars with unfinished, heartless piles of metal. It was reported that the parts brought in from China cracked in the Arctic cold and couldn't withstand the pressure. Result? The Icebreaker 7 project was cancelled. Without icebreakers, the Northern Sea Route freezes in winter. If the route freezes, Russia's trade with Asia dream ends. This chain of failures, stretching from Onega to St. Petersburg, has wiped out Russia's chance of becoming an alternative to Panama and Suez. So, who filled Russia's safe highway void? This is where the second and more destructive domino, energy exports, comes in. Russia's massive LNG projects, Arctic LNG 2, on the Yamal and Gaidan peninsulas were built on this route. Extracting the gas is not enough. It must be transported. However, South Korean shipyards stopped delivering the ice-class tankers they were building for Russia due to sanctions. Russia's own shipyards, Onega and Zvezda, were unable to produce these ships due to a lack of technology. The result? Gas is being produced at facilities that cost billions of dollars to build, but there are no ships to transport it. This gas has become a dead stock with no buyer. This situation is creating a massive strangulation in Russia's energy revenues. And right in the middle of this crisis, the silent giant, Norway, stepped onto the stage and dealt Russia a fatal blow. While Moscow was grappling with its own logistical nightmare, Norway brought the Johan Castberg field in the Arctic fully online. This timing was no coincidence. Seeing Europe's energy hunger, Oslo quietly and deeply filled the market void. Today, more than 30% of the European gas market is under Norwegian control, while Russia's share has fallen to 13% and is rapidly approaching zero. This is not just a market loss, it is the forcible removal of Russia's energy card. While Moscow searched for markets, Oslo closed them. Thus, the new guardians of the North began to represent the Western and safe alternative to Russia's chaotic and dangerous route. If the halt of the icebreaker projects and the collapse of the trade route were merely an economic disaster, Putin might have weathered it. However, when we look at the bigger picture, that giant chessboard, what we see is not a bankruptcy, but a full-fledged military and geopolitical encirclement. Economic collapse is bad, but military encirclement is deadly. Before the war, Russia controlled 53% of the Arctic coastline and had declared Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula untouchable under its bastion defense doctrine. This was the refuge of nuclear submarines. But then came the invasion of Ukraine. Putin claimed he went to war to create a buffer zone in Ukraine, but at the end of the day, he found himself inside an iron ring in the Arctic. Russia's legendary northern fortress fell. The architecture of this siege becomes terrifyingly clear when looking at the map. According to the US Geological Survey's Circum-Arctic Resource Appraisal Report, the figures are staggering. 13% of the world's oil, 30% of its natural gas, and the rare elements that power those famous F-35s are in the Arctic. And Russia? With the longest coastline, it owned the lion's share of this pie, worth nearly $15 trillion, its title deed. This was the sole guarantee that would sustain Russia for the next century, transforming it from a gas station into a global superpower, at least until 2022. But then came Western sanctions. Finland and Sweden joining NATO created an earthquake in Arctic geopolitics. Before the war, there was a balance in the Arctic Council. Now, 7 of the 8 members are NATO members. The Arctic Ocean has effectively become a NATO lake. Murmansk, Russia's nuclear heartland, is now in a kill box. While Norway and new NATO member Finland exert pressure from the west by land, the US and British navies have arrived at the gates of the northern fortress by sea. The moment Russian submarines leave port, they are detected by NATO's underwater listening networks and patrol aircraft. They are no longer the hunters of the ocean, they are now the prey, trapped in their own home. The St. Petersburg port basin is Russia's vital artery to global markets. This region is a strategic center of gravity that shoulders a huge portion of commodity exports by sea. 40% of Russia's oil exports by sea come from here. However, today, this massive logistics complex is grappling with one of the most unprecedented operational crises in its history. Ice formation in the Baltic Sea has plunged Russia into one of its worst crises. A critical port is closing, dozens of ships are waiting in line, and an economic disaster is hitting St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. The crisis is not limited to oil. According to information leaked by the Kommersant newspaper, metal and mineral fertilizer industry groups have also sent urgent letters of complaint to the Ministry of Transport, stating that commodity exports have come to a standstill due to the lack of escort vessels. The physical congestion is expanding to include the port of Ust-Luga. If natural conditions worsen slightly, the ports of Ust-Luga, Primorsk, and Vysotsk will close their doors to all ships with inadequate equipment, regardless of whether they have an escort vessel. The Russian Ministry of Transport issued a desperate warning to ship operators to take the current situation into account when deciding to send ships to the Gulf of Finland. This statement is a clear admission of the state's failure to ensure logistical security. While shipping companies wait for help that is nowhere in sight, billions of dollars worth of cargo is effectively held hostage in the middle of inoperable waters. This operational paralysis in the Baltic Sea is not just a regional bottleneck, but also a strategic choke point, creating seismic waves on Russia's western borders. The extension of waiting times at ports to weeks and St. Petersburg's transformation into a massive parking lot is a direct strangulation effect tightening around the throat of the Kaliningrad region. Kaliningrad is a critically militarized exclave, sandwiched between NATO countries and lacking direct land connection to the Russian mainland. Due to the high geopolitical risks associated with land transport via the Suwalki corridor, Kaliningrad's survival is largely dependent on maritime resupply provided by ships departing from St. Petersburg. Currently, this vital sea route is inoperable due to trapped tankers and immobilized cargo ships. Fuel, ammunition, and essential consumer goods needed by military bases, civilian industry, and power plants in Kaliningrad are trapped in the Baltic Sea. The region's strategic civilian and military supply is primarily coordinated via ferries departing from St. Petersburg and Ust-Luga ports. However, the near-complete halt of ship traffic in the Gulf of Finland is seriously jeopardizing the operation of this vital supply line. The fact that convoys carrying industrial raw materials, military equipment, food, and fuel destined for the region are forced to wait behind these locked-up waters is turning into a complex equation for military and civilian administrators. Even without direct intervention from the West, this garrison, which Moscow relies on, appears to be facing a real risk of strangulation as a result of disruptions in the homeland's logistical planning. The inability of an administration struggling to efficiently manage its own port traffic to logistically support an isolated military region beyond Allied lines raises questions about the Kremlin's deterrence capacity. The administration's failure to deliver the basic infrastructure needed to support these systems in time, despite aiming to project power on the continent with Iskander missiles, can be interpreted as a sign of serious weakness in operational planning. It is highly likely that the civilian population and military personnel stationed in Kaliningrad will experience a certain atmosphere of panic during this prolonged isolation. When we look at the root causes of the incident, the question of why Russia, one of the world's leading military powers, had to withdraw its ships from the Arctic in a moment of crisis becomes important. But to understand why Russia's Arctic dream died, it's not enough to look at the icy gates of the Onega shipyard. We need to turn the camera a little further inside, to the heart of Russian industry, to Yaroslavl and St. Petersburg. Reports leaking out of Yaroslavl show the human face of this collapse. In this industrial city, critical to Russia's engine and parts production, workers have not been paid for months. Putin's war economy has strained the country's production engine, so much that the civilian shipping sector has gone bankrupt due to lack of resources. As economic shockwaves shake the foundations of the war economy, a deep psychological collapse and uncontrollable paranoia have emerged in the corridors of the Kremlin. Statements from the top echelons of the state reveal the extent of this disconnect from reality. An interview given by Nikolai Patrushev, one of Putin's loyal aides, to the Argumenty i Fakty newspaper, is practically a manifesto of this institutional panic. Patrushev resorted to a completely illogical defense mechanism, saying, "We see that the West wants to cripple our trade. If we don't respond, NATO may try to block our access to the seas via the Baltic countries," resorting to a defense mechanism that is completely divorced from logic. Patrushev's accusation that NATO is establishing a naval blockade in the Baltic region is an attempt to cover up the helplessness of their own makeshift fleet in the face of nature and sanctions. The real picture is much more cynical. NATO's navy did not even need to fire a single shot or divert a single frigate from its course. The new sanctions packages prepared by the European Union directly target the shadow fleet's terminals, and the system is collapsing under its own weight, without the need for physical blockade. Russia is being slowly swallowed up in its own territorial waters by the monster it created. The administration that threatened to cut off natural gas to the European continent in winter, freezing people, has now frozen its own oil in its own ports and become a desperate actor, calling on its Arctic fleet to help clear the way for frozen merchant ships. As the European front locks down, a feast of wolves has been set up on the other side of the Atlantic. The North American bloc, the US and Canada, seeing Russia's weakness, has moved to seize its share of the Arctic. Donald Trump's idea of buying Greenland was ridiculed, but today we see more clearly the strategic genius behind this idea. Greenland is not just an icy island, it is North America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. By modernizing the Tula Air Base in Greenland, the US has opened its eyes to any missile threat that Russia might pose from the north. Canada, meanwhile, has made a more aggressive move. Ottawa has declared the Northwest Passage its internal waters and is completely upgrading the NORAD radar systems together with the US. There are no longer any blind spots against Russian missiles, and the most lethal move, the F-35s. The US Air Force has permanently relocated its F-35 stealth fighter fleets to Alaska as of 2025. This puts Russia's easternmost tip directly within the threat range across the Bering Strait. Russia is now surrounded not only from the west, but also from the east and north. The North American bloc is waiting like a vulture, ready to fill Russia's void in the Arctic. NATO locked the door, Norway stole the market, the US pointed its weapons. But the most humiliating blow for Russia came from China, which it had declared its unlimited friend. This is the most ruthless form of diplomatic chess. China is not an ally for Russia. It is a predator, waiting for its weakened prey. This is where the geo-economic trap comes into play. China is actually a loan shark for Russia, and Russia is now a helpless customer, unable to pay its debts. Beijing began infiltrating the region by defining itself as a near-Arctic state. Russia's Arctic dominance had only one address it could knock on: China. Russia is now forced to charter Chinese ships to trade in its own territorial waters and transport goods in its own ocean. Russia's sovereignty has been transformed into China's lease agreement. China is ruthlessly exploiting this vulnerability. Russia is closing the oil and gas it extracts from the Arctic at nearly cost, 30 to 40% below global market prices. Russia is no longer China's strategic partner, but its raw material colony. Ports are being transferred to Chinese companies, mining rights sold to Beijing. The northern territories that Russia has defended with bloodshed for 300 years are being sold piece by piece to China economically. Putin, fleeing NATO, has fallen into the dragon's mouth. This is not a partnership. This is a foreclosure. When we calculate the cost of this destruction, the picture that emerges is horrific. The total value of Arctic reserves is nearly $25 trillion. In 2021, Russia's share was around $15 trillion and 80% regional dominance. By 2025, that dominance had fallen below 50% and is rapidly eroding. Just in the last 3 years, when you factor in the delays in the cancelled Arctic LNG-2 project, production halted due to the cutoff of Western technology, and sales made at a loss to China. $5 trillion. Yes, nearly $5 trillion of Russia's future has evaporated. The Arctic was designed to be Russia's future. Now it has turned into a cold, vast prison with no way out, its resources exploited by others. Putin was so focused on the maps of the 20th century that he lost sight of the geography of the 21st century. For every inch of mud gained in the south, an ocean was sacrificed in the north. A potential $15 trillion turned into a $5 trillion loss. The Onega shipyard became a metal graveyard, and the northern fortress turned into a wreck.
And this is a paper tiger. Then what is NATO itself?
Vladimir Putin believed that NATO would be paralyzed without the United States. He was betting on its brain death. However, starting in February 2026, he found not a fragmented alliance, but a fully coordinated NATO under Turkey's amphibious command. This is where things get strange. Because Turkey is the same power that has crushed Russia's military doctrine on multiple fronts over the past decade. Turkey has repeatedly disrupted Russia's geopolitical games in the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea. It has turned Russia's billion-dollar USD military investments into scrap heaps with asymmetric drone warfare. For centuries, two ancient rivals in the Black Sea, Turkey and Russia, have been at each other's throats. But for the first time in history, they are facing each other in a completely different sea. The Baltic Sea. Steadfast Dart 26. At the center of military maneuvers, the Pentagon is not in the decision-making and implementing seat for the first time. Ankara is filling this massive power vacuum that has emerged on the European continent. One of Germany's leading publications, Kieler Nachrichten, carried a striking headline summarizing the situation. Turkey takes the US's place in NATO. This new reality has caused outright panic in the Kremlin. When we look at the operational dimension on the ground, the scale of the issue becomes much clearer. The Turkish armed forces have deployed a massive military force 6,450 kilometers away from their borders with a flawless logistics network. When the Turkish 66th Mechanized Infantry Brigade landed at Wunstorf Air Base, it brought with it 2,000 soldiers and 149 advanced armored vehicles. This activity on the ground signifies the revival of a war readiness reflex that Western European armies had long forgotten. Images reflected on social media revealed the dynamism of fully equipped Turkish soldiers, contrasting them with tired European troops and demonstrating who has the psychological upper hand on the ground. However, the counterpart to this formidable presence on land involves a much more sophisticated strategy at sea. Looking at the historical process, in Idlib, Syria, Turkish UAV swarms destroyed Russian-backed armored divisions from the air. Russian-made Pantsir air defense systems were blinded. The same scenario was repeated in Al-Watiya, Libya. The Pantsir S-1 air defense systems, worth tens of millions of dollars, which Russia called impregnable, were systematically hunted down by Turkish drones. Russian mercenaries were buried in the desert. In Karabakh, defense lines built according to Russian architecture over many years collapsed in 44 days. At the start of the war in Ukraine, Turkish armed unmanned aerial vehicles were the first trigger in stopping Russian convoys reaching Kyiv. And in the Black Sea? The Russian Black Sea Fleet, suffocated by Montreux and hunted by Turkish-made TB2s, was confined to ports. Many warships, including the flagship, were sent to the bottom of the sea. All of this had seriously tested Moscow's operational limits. Now the same technological asymmetry, the same nightmare, has moved to the Baltic, to St. Petersburg's windpipe, directly opposite Kaliningrad. During the exercise, the TB3s hit their targets with pinpoint accuracy. NATO Brunsum Commander General Gerhards personally applauded this. The reaction of Putin's advisor Patrushev shows the extent of the hysteria in the Kremlin. Patrushev clearly stated in an interview with Argumenti I Fakti, NATO is creating a multinational force with offensive capabilities in the Baltic. The plans include the blockade of Kaliningrad and the seizure of Russian merchant ships. He added, "If we do not respond, the British, French, and even the Baltic countries could attempt to block our access to the seas. If we don't respond." This phrase is the product of a defensive psychology. The Kremlin views this exercise not as a routine training activity, but as an existential threat. And Patrushev's emphasis on the shadow fleet is particularly noteworthy. Russia has established a logistics network disguised as commercial ships to circumvent international sanctions. Billions of dollars in illegal oil trade are conducted through this shadow fleet. The Baltic Sea is one of the most critical routes for this network. Now, under the uninterrupted lens of unmanned aerial vehicles launched from the TCG Anadolu, every ship and every movement is being monitored. NATO's intense surveillance umbrella has placed the Russian shadow fleet and military cargo ships under a strategic quarantine mentality. This is, in the truest sense, a feeling of strategic suffocation, and Patrushev openly admits this. And now, this power, which has given a masterclass in defeating Russia, is in the Baltic Sea, at the heart of NATO, on Germany's shores, teaching European armies how to stop Russia. This is Putin's nightmare. He is not facing a slow, bureaucratic Europe with a sluggish decision-making mechanism. He is facing a command structure that takes initiative in the field, is technologically independent, and knows Russia's weak points by heart. Let's look at the bigger picture, because the Turkish presence in the Baltic is not an isolated event. It is the final piece of a much larger puzzle. To the south is the Black Sea. Turkey controls the Straits under the Montreux Convention. Looking even further down, the Mediterranean, the most critical logistical route for Russia's projection through its Tartus base in Syria, from the Black Sea through the Straits to Tartus, again passes through the bottleneck controlled by Turkey. And now, in the north, the Baltic. TCG Anadolu is deployed near Kaliningrad, around Sweden's strategic key, Gotland Island. Gotland is the geographical hub of the Baltic Sea, the most valuable Baltic asset that fell into the hands of the alliance when Sweden joined NATO. When you put these three seas side by side, the picture that emerges is striking. An arc encircling Russia's sea routes from north to south. The world order is entering a new phase, where the American umbrella is partially closing, and the pains of this transition are reverberating in the Baltic waters. Turkey deployed not only land forces, but also a naval armada to the Baltic Sea in the role of amphibious task force commander. The task force, consisting of TCG Derya, TCG Istanbul, TCG Oruç Reis, and TCG Anadolu, which became the flagship of the alliance, set sail from Foça and emerged as a floating military base in the middle of the sea, gathering intelligence and possessing high strike power. During the amphibious landing operations, one of the most critical phases of the exercise, the level of Turkish engineering impressed the Allies. While observing the amphibious assault maneuvers from sea to shore, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius paid special attention to the armored amphibious assault vehicles, ZAHA, in the Turkish Navy's inventory. Minister Pistorius's act of recording these marvels of high engineering with his own cell phone and personally thanking Navy Commander Admiral Ercüment Tatlıoğlu goes beyond a simple diplomatic courtesy. The pinnacle of these operational successes was in the sky. The Bayraktar TB3 armed unmanned aerial vehicle, which took off from the deck of TCG Anadolu, hit its target with precision in the harsh Baltic winter, heralding a new doctrine in naval aviation. NATO Brunsum Joint Forces Commander, General Gerhards, personally applauded this flawless strike and expressed his gratitude to the Turkish armed forces. Turkey has proven in the field that it can produce much more cost-effective and destructive solutions against conventional threats. This situation signals that NATO's future air defense and attack plans could be reshaped beyond classic warplanes through such innovative autonomous platforms. Turkey has proven that it can produce much more cost-effective and destructive solutions against conventional threats, with this technological asymmetry it has brought to the field. Turkey is not merely a participant in this exercise, it has emerged as the power holding the reins, standing opposite Russia. From July 2025 to June 2026, Turkey will assume the roles of Amphibious Task Force Commander, CATF, and Landing Force Commander, CLF. The New York Times reported this fact in its pages. This is proof that the European security architecture has moved out from under the American umbrella and been entrusted to the army with the most combat experience in Eurasia. This is where things get strange, because this new reality has caused outright panic in the Kremlin. Now let's look at the map through the Kremlin's eyes and understand why the alarms are ringing in Moscow. Open the map. St. Petersburg, Russia's window to Europe. Kaliningrad, an isolated Russian enclave, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, heavily armed. For decades, Moscow viewed the Baltic Sea as its own playground. It threatened to split NATO in two via the Suwalki corridor. The Iskander missiles and S-400 batteries in Kaliningrad symbolized Russia's power in the region. But today, to the north, Sweden and Finland, new NATO members. To the south, Poland and Germany. And in the middle of the sea, a mobile Turkish airbase, TCG Anadolu. The Baltic Sea has not only become a NATO lake, it has become a strategic bottleneck for Russia, with its exit narrowing. Putin's Baltic strategy was based on several assumptions. If the US withdraws, NATO will disintegrate. The Baltic is our backyard. We can pull Turkey out of the alliance. Steadfast Dart 26 debunked all three of these assumptions. The panic in Moscow is not just about this show of force in the Baltic Sea. The Kremlin's real fear runs deeper. When Putin's advisors look at the map, they experience a sense of déjà vu. Because the TCG Anadolu is not a classic amphibious ship. It is a drone carrier. It carries Bayraktar TB3s. And Russia has learned the hard way over the past decade what Turkish drones are capable of. The Steadfast Dart 26 exercise is not merely a military training activity. It serves as a laboratory where Europe's security architecture is being completely reimagined. The United States' shift toward the Pacific axis had long been a secret fear in European capitals. The question, "What will we do if Washington abandons us?" was a dilemma that kept German and French bureaucrats awake at night. However, Turkey's spectacular entry into the Baltic arena provided an unexpected balancing factor for a panicked Europe. This scenario is the first major fragment of the post-American Europe era. The political and economic giants of the European Union, Germany and France, are unable to produce independent deterrents against Russia due to their heavy bureaucratic structures and weak military cultures. This military vacuum is being filled by middle powers that are inherently prone to using hard power, have extensive war experience, and can make quick decisions. Turkey and Poland increasing their weight within NATO to form a new security backbone means that the cards are being reshuffled in the global balance of power. European security is now being addressed not only from Brussels or Washington, but also from Ankara, which unites the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Baltic lines under a single geopolitical vision. Putin's long-term strategy was based on widening the cracks within NATO and taking advantage of the US's isolationist policies to pull Eastern Europe back into its sphere of influence. However, this new defensive wall established in the Baltic region has disrupted the Kremlin's plans. While the Russian administration expected to face a sluggish European bureaucracy struggling to make decisions, it encountered the Turkish armed forces, known for taking initiative on the ground, integrating products from the domestic defense industry, and their operational speed in conflict zones. This situation initiated a process of doctrinal decay that nullified Russia's military and psychological deterrence. The US's lack of active participation in the exercise was not a weakness. On the contrary, it served as a catalyst to mobilize the alliance's internal potential. Starting from the Baltic Sea and extending to the Black Sea, the Caucasus, Syria, and the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey has built a wall that virtually isolates Russia along a vertical line. The stance taken by TCG Anadolu off the coast of Germany paves the way for possible bilateral strategic pacts with the Baltic countries and Poland in the future. Positive feedback from NATO command centers and the high level of satisfaction expressed by the German Ministry of Defense confirm that Turkey has risen from being merely a flanking country to a keystone state, ensuring the security of the center. While Russia dreams of returning to its former glory days, it is forced to face the high-tech barrier of Turkish naval and air power at its most important gateways to the seas. This is not a simple tactical obstacle. It is a long-term strategic checkmate that narrows Russia's sphere of global influence. The Baltic Sea is no longer a tranquil arena where the Russian fleet can cruise freely. That era is over. The great misconception that NATO would be paralyzed without the United States, that the alliance's decision-making mechanism would collapse, has been shattered and scattered along the German coast. This vision, brought to the field by the Turkish army under the leadership of TCG Anadolu, has torn up the map of Europe in Putin's mind. Europe's defense line has been reshaped by a dynamic force that has repeatedly proven itself in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, breaking free from rigid bureaucracy. Russia's attempt to establish an empire of fear via Kaliningrad has been reduced to a grand illusion under the silent patrols of Turkish UA verses. Armored vehicles on highways and fleets waiting at sea show that the message to Moscow is crystal clear. The new security architecture is in place. The bear is no longer blind, but every step it takes is being watched. The rules of the game have been rewritten. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Turkey, NATO's most criticized, most peculiar, most independent-minded member, the alliance's most problematic name on the map. The strange part, this country buys air defense missiles from Russia, bargains regularly with Putin, and has never cut its trade with him. In short, it's treated as the alliance's biggest troublemaker. Yet Erdogan, wielding his defense industry and his personal rapport with Trump, stands out as a rare actor able to constrain Russia's freedom of maneuver. And its hosting of the NATO summit on July 7th and 8th, 2026, is the peak of that. So what, exactly, will be discussed at that table? By the leaked declaration, Russia will be openly branded a threat, and far harder measures will follow. Beyond that, the United States may hand Europe's security largely back to Europe, and, as the load bearer of that flank, largely to Turkey. The shift experts call NATO 3.0 is reshaping the alliance. Moscow, for its part, hopes less to win on the battlefield than to watch NATO crack from within at this very moment. Two questions sit on everyone's mind. Will this summit open the door to a ceasefire, or drag things into even more intractable chaos? Beneath those two questions lies a deeper one. Why is Turkey so indispensable to NATO, and why does it so unnerve Putin's Russia? We'll answer all of it, step by step, in this video. But first, a small request. Independent geopolitical and war analysis like this is increasingly throttled by the algorithm, and the video isn't reaching many of the people who'd want to see it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It takes only a few seconds. And to read that table correctly, we first have to understand Turkey. Turkey isn't merely the one country Putin genuinely fears outside the United States or NATO's problem child. It's also the only NATO member ever to have downed a Russian warplane, the only one standing up to Russia across 3 continents and 4 separate fronts at once, and the country that has held, for 300 years, the lock guarding Russia's greatest strategic dream, reaching the warm, open seas. It all begins with geography, in 2 narrow waterways, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. These are the Black Sea's only gateway to the open oceans, and the key to that gate is in Turkey's hands. In peacetime, commerce flows freely, but the moment a war breaks out, Turkey decides which warship may pass and which may not. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Ankara did exactly that. It closed the Straits to warships. The result? By many analysts' reckoning, the move kept the conflict from spilling across the entire Black Sea. Russia couldn't reinforce its Baltic or Mediterranean fleets into the Black Sea. No outside power could push warships into the region either. With a single move, Turkey froze the military balance of an entire sea, and without firing a shot. Yet controlling the Straits is only half the job. The war seeded the Black Sea with an invisible danger: drifting mines. Some of the mines laid along Ukraine's coast broke free of their moorings and drifted into international shipping lanes. A single drifting mine can sink a cargo ship or paralyze grain and energy routes for days. Who's on the water against that threat? Turkey, again. The Turkish Navy, together with Romania and Bulgaria, all 3 NATO members, all 3 Black Sea littoral states, hunts these mines. And once the war ends, that same trio will run the far larger clearance operation off Ukraine's coast. In short, keeping the Black Sea open to trade, keeping grain and energy flowing, hinges largely on Turkey's presence in the field. Yet Turkey doesn't confine Russia to the Black Sea alone. Today, it's the only NATO country standing up to Russia across 3 continents and 4 separate fronts at once. The first proof came in November 2015. Turkey shot down a Russian Su-24 that had violated its airspace on the Syrian border, the first NATO member to down a Russian jet since the 1950s. And that was no one-off act of nerve. The first front, in Europe, the Black Sea. The second, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean and Syria. Turkey backed the anti-Assad opposition, And today, it's not Russia's ally Assad in Damascus, but a new government led by a former oppositionist. The third front, in Asia, the Caucasus. Turkey backed Azerbaijan, and in 2020, Bayraktar drones turned the tide against Russia's traditional ally, Armenia. The fourth front, in Africa, Libya. Turkish Bayraktars kept the Tripoli government standing against Russia-backed Haftar forces. 3 continents, 4 fronts, and in most of these theaters, what shifted the balance was Turkish technology. All of that is in the past, and Russia has sharpened its own edge. The war taught it hard lessons. Even so, what truly unnerves Russia about Turkey is something else. The quiet revolution in its defense industry and its across-the-board contribution to the alliance. The symbol of that rise is a single name, Bayraktar. Combat proven in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and most strikingly in Ukraine, these drones have been exported to more than 30 countries. And Turkey no longer just sells drones. Its indigenous fifth-generation fighter, KAAN, is preparing for its first flights this year, and Indonesia has already signed for 48 aircraft. Just how seriously is this rise taken? To answer, look no further than May 2026. Belgium's Queen Matilda arrived in Turkey with the largest Belgian economic delegation in 14 years. More than 400 business figures, 5 ministers, a crowd of roughly 500 people. And her first stop? Not a palace, not a museum. Baykar's Technology Center in Istanbul, the maker of the Bayraktar and KAAN. The Queen took a briefing in person from Selçuk Bayraktar, who also happens to be Erdogan's son-in-law, toured the production lines, and received a scale model of the Kizil Elma drone as a gift. And Selçuk Bayraktar told her, "Drones are one of the greatest deterrents. If you produce enough of them, no one can attack you." To the defense industry of a country the West once scolded, Europe's Queen now comes for a briefing. The numbers bear it out. Baykar alone holds 60% of the global drone export market, and Turkey's total share is 65%. And this industry now supplies NATO allies as well. Poland bought $410 million worth of electronic warfare systems from Turkey for its Bayraktars, the first such sale to a NATO member. The relationship with Ukraine runs both ways. Turkey delivered the Bayraktar to Ukraine before the 2022 invasion, at a time when no Western country would provide lethal arms. In return, Ukraine today builds engines for Turkey's fighters and drones, so much so that the Turkish Kizil Elma drone is called a Turkish bird with a Ukrainian heart. Another moment that unsettled Putin came at the very start of 2026, and right on his northern doorstep, in the Baltic Sea. For the first time in history, after the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, Turkey turned up at Russia's door in the Baltic too. NATO's largest deployment exercise of the year, Steadfast Dart 2026, ran from January to March, hosted by Germany. The first striking detail, no American forces took part, which many observers read as a test of NATO's capacity to operate without US support. So, who stepped into that gap? Turkey. In the words of Colonel Matthias Bernke, spokesperson for NATO's Joint Force Command Brunsum, Turkey is the nation providing the largest contribution to this exercise. The core forces and a significant portion of the units come from Turkey. And Turkey, for the first time, held NATO's Commander Amphibious Task Force role. The command vessel for the maritime operations was the Turkish Navy's flat-deck ship, the TCG Anadolu. And there, a historic first unfolded. An armed Bayraktar TB3 drone lifted off from the deck of the TCG Anadolu, struck a maritime target in the Baltic with a precision munition, and recovered back aboard. The first time in Alliance history that an armed drone completed a full launch strike recovery cycle from a flat-deck ship. NATO Commander General Ingo Gerhards personally congratulated the Turkish naval forces after the hit. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius and Bundeswehr Chief of Defense General Carsten Breuer observed the landing phase on site. Now picture the whole scene. The Turkish Navy moved a task group roughly 8,000 kilometers from its homeland. Turkish warships entered the Baltic at this scale for the first time. And there, they effectively anchored as the core force, an exercise the United States wasn't even at. This is exactly where indispensable becomes visible. In an era of steady American withdrawal, the answer to the question of defending Europe against Russia now runs largely through Ankara. For Russia, that means its centuries-old southern wall now rises against it in the north as well. The last card is the subtlest, diplomacy. Turkey is almost the only country inside NATO able to sit at the table with both Kyiv and Moscow. It hosted the Istanbul talks at the war's outset and mediated prisoner swaps and the grain deal. Channels one side slams shut, Turkey can keep open. And it's precisely that independent line, independent enough to risk Western sanctions, yet indispensable enough to hold the alliance's southern gate, that turns the personal channel between Erdogan and Trump into leverage for Ankara. At a time when Trump questions his commitment to NATO, leader-to-leader ties that can keep the US at the table are more valuable than ever. And that posture has a name: strategic autonomy. Yet the autonomy Turkey has in mind differs from Europe's. It isn't a quest for institutional independence, but the ability to do business with several centers of power at once in a multipolar world. Ankara surrenders fully neither to Washington nor to Brussels. It works its own room to maneuver to the hilt, both inside NATO and outside it. That is why it's hard for allies to predict, and, for that very flexibility, indispensable. To keep this picture complete, the other side of the coin deserves a look. Even as Turkey breaks Russia, it doesn't burn its bridges with it entirely. It buys Russian natural gas through the Turk Stream pipeline and is trying to become an energy hub. The Akuyu nuclear plant built by Rosatom, along with tourism and trade, binds the two economies together. This may look like a weakness, yet it's the essence of Turkey's balance. Ankara constrains Russia militarily and geographically, but doesn't shut the economic doors altogether. It's that both at once capacity that keeps Turkey a voice that still carries where no other NATO country can reach, inside the Kremlin. For Russia, the upshot is ambivalent. Turkey is neither an outright enemy nor a dependable friend, an uncontrollable variable that must be reckoned with constantly. And what unnerves a great power most is precisely the neighbor it cannot control. A quick pause. Independent geopolitical analysis like this gets throttled by the algorithm. A like, a one-word comment, and your subscription directly help the video reach far more people. Because we now turn to where all these cards converge, to the summit's real purpose. Can NATO hold together? And why does Russia fear that? When all these cards come to one table in Ankara on July 7th and 8th, the real stakes are far larger than they appear. The Ankara summit isn't only about Ukraine. It's about whether this alliance can stay together at all. Under the Trump administration, Washington wants Europe to carry the bulk of its own security. In an approach the Pentagon frames not as burden sharing, but as burden transfer, the US shifts its weight to its own hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific, while Europe takes on its own conventional defense. And this is no fit of Trumpian temper. It's a trend larger and longer-lived than him. In short, the European security order that has leaned on American leadership since the Cold War is being rewritten. That's what underlies the €140 billion pledge to Ukraine. Europeans and Canada shoulder nearly all of it, not the US. So that figure isn't merely support for Kyiv. It's Europe's message, to Moscow and to Washington alike, that I can carry my own security. And this is exactly where Russia's real hope hides. For Moscow, the ideal outcome is less a battlefield win than NATO cracking from within. The Kremlin works to inflame every friction between Europe and Washington. That's why 32 countries in Ankara, with Trump in the frame, delivering a single unity photograph, is the shot Russia least wants to see. And the summit's real purpose is to show the world, and the Kremlin, exactly that shot. So how does that purpose translate into concrete decisions at the table? By the leaked draft declaration, the alliance defines Russia as a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security and reaffirms its steel-clad commitment to Article 5. European allies and Canada pledge Ukraine a combined €140 billion in military support over 2 years. And one detail sums up the whole scene. This summit, with Trump attending, is held on the soil of the one bridge country that can still talk to Russia: Turkey. The summit's backdrop only adds to Turkey's weight. The recent war with Iran exposed how fragile NATO's southern flank is, and Turkey stands squarely in its center. In a period of shaken transatlantic trust, the alliance again reaffirms its Article 5 commitment and its target of spending 5% of national income on defense by 2035. The declaration was kept deliberately short to avoid friction with Trump. Even Zelensky was left on the sidelines of the main session so as not to unsettle him. So Turkey hosts not just a meeting, but a delicate balance the world is holding its breath over. And at the NATO Defense Industry Forum on July 7th, Turkey takes its seat to gain access to the very European defense funds it had been shut out of. The maker of the drones the alliance wants most is asking to be brought inside its own mechanisms. So what comes next? 3 possibilities sit on the table, and in all 3, Turkey's weight is decisive. First, a ceasefire. Ukraine, backed by European leaders, proposed an unconditional ceasefire. Russia rejected it. Putin isn't backing down and keeps striking cities. Even market forecasts put the odds of a deal by year's end below 50%. So the most likely near-term scenario is the war grinding on in this attritional balance. Second, say a ceasefire does come one day. Who guarantees it? Here, Turkey's role turns pivotal. Ankara has established a maritime component command in Istanbul, under the Montreux framework and Turkish command, to run the Black Sea leg of any post-peace security guarantees for Ukraine. So even on the day the war ends, Turkey will again sit at the Black Sea heart of the machinery keeping the peace. Third, and most dangerous, not a ceasefire, but an unraveling, not of Ukraine, but of NATO. Trump's withdrawal threats and the erosion of transatlantic trust feed the exact scenario Moscow awaits. In such a world, Turkey's strategic autonomy line only sharpens, an actor bound to no bloc, doing business with several centers of power at once in a multipolar order. And whichever scenario unfolds, ceasefire, long war, or a loosening of the alliance, the gate of the Black Sea, the production of the drones, and the open line to Moscow all stay in the same hand. Step back, and the picture sharpens. Turkey is indispensable to NATO because it holds the Black Sea's only gate. It keeps the balance on that sea. It builds the drones the alliance wants. It maintains the bridge to Moscow. And it works the personal channels that keep the US at the table. And that is exactly why it unnerves Putin. The ceiling on his naval power in the Black Sea is set by the width of a strait. The weapons that pinned his army in the field are built beyond his border. And the summit, now branding him a threat and pledging Ukraine 140 billion euros, convenes on the soil of the one country still able to talk to Russia. Here's the paradox. The NATO country Moscow most needs to keep close is the one quietly doing it the most harm. And as the war drags on, and the Black Sea, the drones, and the energy grow only more important, that paradox will sharpen further. Because the key to all 3 sits in the same hand. As those flags rise over Ankara, the message to the Kremlin is implicit but clear. The gate of the Black Sea, and increasingly, the gate to NATO's future, runs through Ankara.
Brothers, I think this is an absolute record. There has never been such a queue before the bridge.
This is what the beginning of the end looks like. Russians. Ukraine has just pulled the plug on Crimea. In the first days of July 2026, Ukraine's heavy warhead FP2 drones went after the peninsula's power backbone. This cut off the entire ecosystem that sustained Russian operations in this strategic territory. Putin's crown jewel is now plunged into total darkness, while 2.4 million people are struggling to survive. By Ukrainian accounts and OSINT footage, 16 distribution substations were struck in just 48 hours, and some 37 substations and plants across the occupied south between July 1st and 5th. The result, by those same sources, much of the peninsula now living on only 8 to 10 hours of electricity a day. Yet the real story isn't in the substations, it's on Russian people's faces.
Crimeans don't want reports, but answers as to why we were abandoned.
For the more than 1 million Russians living in Crimea, this darkness has stopped being a matter of comfort and turned into a matter of survival.
This is Yevpatoria. Such things are hanging everywhere.
And at that point, no one cares anymore about Putin's authority or who Crimea belongs to. What one Russian said while waiting hours in a fuel line, in a social media post that went viral, a Russian citizen said the following about the situation.
What do we need your Crimea for? What do we need these Ukrainians who cause us all these problems?
From the mouth of an ordinary Russian, about a place marketed for 12 years as sacred Russian soil, that sentence is an alarm bell for Putin. The people he brought here no longer want the land, or him. And the timing is where it truly wounds Putin. Just as his authority cracks in Crimea, at his weakest moment, NATO, on July 7th and 8th, gathers in Ankara, directly across from this peninsula with which Turkey shares deep historical ties, to formally brand Russia a long-term threat. On one side, a victory sinking into darkness. On the other, an alliance at the gate of that victory, pressing Putin toward the table, perhaps toward a ceasefire. And as we'll see, this darkness isn't confined to Crimea. But first, a small request. Independent war and technology analysis like this is increasingly throttled by the algorithm, and this video isn't reaching many of the people who'd want to see it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It takes only a few seconds. The first thing that collapsed alongside the darkness was authority itself. The very office meant to manage this crisis is admitting it has no fix. Even Putin's own hand-picked occupation governor, Sergei Aksyonov, concedes on camera that fuel won't grow plentiful anytime soon, and that public complaints about blackouts and transport rise by the day. The administration had already declared a de facto state of emergency on the peninsula on June 26th. And on June 28th, Putin himself was forced to admit, however he softened it as not critical, the countrywide fuel shortage. When a leader's man on the ground says he has no answer, this is no longer a manageable glitch. And once authority collapses, what's left is how people feel: panic and abandonment. Social media fills with posts themed, "We're trapped! Putin has forgotten us here." In a place sold for 12 years as Russia forever, that sense of abandonment is growing inside the very population Putin himself brought here. So why does this panic run so deep? The darkness didn't just switch off the lights. In a modern region, electricity is the single artery everything hangs on, and here's how the chain snapped. Water pumps run on electricity. Cut the power and taps run dry, and when sewage pumps stop, waste backs up. And by footage from the ground, some of Crimea's water pumps had already stopped because the diesel that ran them can no longer be sourced. With refrigerators dead, the cold chain breaks and food spoils. Card readers and ATMs don't work without power, so anyone without cash can't even buy bread. Cell towers and the internet backbone fail as backup power drains. And the cruelest loop of all, fuel pumps run on electricity too, so when the power goes, you can't even dispense fuel. On top of this, production collapses too. Again, by footage from the ground, once fuel and power were cut, farming in Crimea halted entirely, workers were sent home, and fields sat empty in the middle of harvest season. And all of it plays out in the July heat, without air conditioning, without ice. So the issue isn't the lights went out. It's water, money, communication, food, fuel, and cooling being severed all at once. And onto this already unlivable picture is layered one more thing: injustice. And this is what sharpens the anger most. The scarcity isn't shared equally. By information from the ground, also reported by Al Jazeera, the fuel that remains on the peninsula goes first to the state and the military. The ordinary citizen comes dead last. While the army and the administration find fuel, the public waits 12 hours in line and can take only 20 litres. And that injustice is starkest at the pump. By local accounts, even that 20-litre cap isn't for everyone. For black marketeers and the well-connected, the rules simply don't apply. So on one side, ordinary families punching holes in jerry cans to squeeze in more fuel, sleeping in line. On the other, a minority living outside the rules. When access to power, fuel, and transport is set by who comes first, the public's patience runs out, and the anger turns directly on the administration. How many does this anger and panic cover? There's no exact figure here, but with the data we have, we can reason it out. By the occupation administration's own count, between 2.3 and 2.4 million people live in Crimea today. Yet not all of them are the "who would flee" group. Those considering leaving are mainly the ones who came to the peninsula from Russia. By sources such as the Jamestown Foundation, after the 2014 annexation, Moscow moved an estimated 800,000 to 1 million settlers here. Officials, soldiers, security personnel, pensioners and their families. This is the population most likely to leave, and some of them had already begun quietly departing back in 2022 when the war began. So the peninsula was seeing a slow outflow even before this crisis erupted. For those who remain, the equation has now flipped entirely. A peninsula without power, without water, without fuel, and increasingly unfair, has ceased to be livable for them. So how large is the evacuation? By leaked and independently unverified reports, Russian authorities have drawn up an evacuation plan covering, as a priority, official personnel and their families, reaching up to 250,000. But here's the crucial point. This is only the priority list, who the state pulls out first. It doesn't cover ordinary Russians. So the real question isn't, are 250,000 fleeing? It's how many of the hundreds of thousands Moscow settled here over 12 years still want to stay at all. That striking number in the title isn't a certainty, it's a warning. This is a collapse that potentially affects millions. A quick pause. Liking, a one-word comment, and your subscription directly help this video reach far more people. Because now we turn to how that exodus became a bottleneck, even a trap, and how this crisis has spilled far beyond Crimea. That will to leave takes its most concrete form in one place, the Kerch Bridge, the sole land link tying the peninsula to Russia. By footage from June 29th, a record queue formed on the exit side. One recording shows roughly 2,800 vehicles, another more than 2,000. Satellite imagery captured lines 10 to 15 kilometers long. And note this, the entry side, from Russia into Crimea, is nearly empty. Traffic runs one way, out. Yet leaving isn't easy either, because the exit route and the fuel line have become the same bottleneck. At the stations near the Kerch Bridge, there are 12-hour queues for fuel, with no guarantee you'll get any. By one published assessment, some 2,450 vehicles trying to leave the peninsula last week piled up at that same bridge. So what about the sea route? It was struck too. When the Kerch Bridge clogged, the second option people pinned their hopes on was the ferry. But Ukraine hit the Kavkaz port, from which the ferries depart, and ferry service has been suspended since that strike. Then, on July 3rd and 4th, the Kerch ferry terminal itself was set ablaze in an overnight attack. So Crimea had two ways out, the bridge and the ferry, and now the bridge is locked with 15-kilometer queues, the ferry both suspended and struck. In the words of the Ukrainian commander nicknamed Magyar, Robert Brovdy, the safe haven myth has collapsed. And this exodus had begun from within the administration itself, before the ordinary public. By reporting from the pro-Ukrainian Atesh resistance group and RBC Ukraine, Black Sea Fleet officers began moving their families to Novorossiysk on the far shore without waiting for any official order. Panic grew so severe that Occupation Administration advisor Oleg Kryuchkov was forced to tell the public to block accounts posing as an officer's daughter or the wife of a soldier at the front. And when an administration tells its citizens to silence one another, the rumor has already become fact. And here's the pivotal point. This nightmare isn't confined to occupied Crimea. It has spilled across the border into Russia's own territory. Ukraine's long-range, satellite-guided HIMARS rockets are now pounding Russia's Belgorod region on the Ukrainian border too. On July 4th, in nearly the same days as the wave over Crimea, a major strike hit Belgorod's energy infrastructure, by reports, with at least 25 rockets. Among the targets were the Belgorod thermal power plant and substations at the Luch power facility. And just as in Crimea, the admission came from the governor. Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov confirmed the strike, said energy facilities were hit and significant power outages followed. Traffic lights failed, elevators stopped, entire districts fell dark. In one attack, more than 500,000 people across the region were reported left without power. And Gladkov had earlier urged residents to be ready to temporarily relocate to other regions if heat and power were cut, even advising families to send children to relatives where there is heat and electricity. He described the region's energy losses as nearly catastrophic in scale. So the helplessness Aksyonov faces in Crimea has its twin across the border in Gladkov. Two different places, two different governors, but the same scene. Struck power plants, dark districts, and an administration preparing its people to evacuate. And these two regions are only the two most visible corners of a far wider picture. Ukraine's long-range campaign against refineries and the power system has deepened a fuel crisis across Russia as a whole. By independent analyses, a large share of Russia's 83 regions face fuel supply strain, and in dozens sales have effectively been rationed. So the queues at the Kerch Bridge aren't an exception. They're the sharpest edge of a pattern spreading nationwide. And this reveals why the matter is so dangerous for Putin. Return to that rule from the start. A leader's power rests on the perception of control. But when the governor of occupied Crimea, the governor of his own Belgorod, and the local administrations of dozens of regions are all saying, "We have no fix, be ready to evacuate," that perception of control cracks. Ukraine's strategy is exactly this. Unable to break Russia at the front line, it wears it down from within and from the depth, striking at the source the energy and fuel that keep it standing. And Crimea's darkness is really the most visible face of a far larger story. Russia is losing the Black Sea. The first sign came months ago. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, which once ruled the entire sea, was forced to pull back east from its historic base at Sevastopol to Novorossiysk under Ukraine's drone and missile strikes. The British Ministry of Defence at one point described the fleet as functionally inactive. And a version of Crimea's panic played out at sea too. By the pro-Ukrainian Atesh, fleet officers had already begun moving their families out of Sevastopol back in June. And the strategic meaning is immense. Crimea was Russia's fortress in the Black Sea. The S-400s, Caliber missiles, and Bastion coastal defense systems based here held nearly the entire sea under Russian threat. Pushed east, that reach shrank to just the eastern third of the sea. So, as Crimea goes dark, Russia's shadow over the water shrinks with it. So who rises into that vacuum? The answer ties to a single country: Turkey. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the Black Sea's only gateway to the open seas, are in Turkey's hands. And thanks to the 1936 Montreux Convention, Ankara shut that gate to warships the moment the war broke out in 2022. The three NATO members on the Black Sea, Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, already run the mine clearing together. And at the heart of any post-peace Black Sea security sits a Turkish maritime command, established in Istanbul under the Montreux framework. And this is exactly why the place and timing of this week's summit are no accident. On July 7th and 8th, NATO gathers in the capital of the very country holding the gate to the Black Sea, Ankara. The message on the table is grim for the Kremlin. By the leaked draft declaration, the alliance brands Russia a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security and reaffirms its steel-clad commitment to Article 5. The numbers drive it home. European allies and Canada pledge Ukraine a combined 140 billion euros in military support over 2 years, and nearly all of it is shouldered by the Europeans, not America. This is part of a larger shift experts call NATO 3.0, or burden transfer. As America pulls its weight back, Europe begins to carry its own security, and the Black Sea on its own shoulders. Now set the two pictures side by side. On one side, Crimea, Putin's crown in the Black Sea. In darkness, its people in the escape line, its fleet pulled east. On the other, a summit at the gate of that very sea where 32 countries brand Putin a threat and pledge Ukraine 140 billion euros. So as Putin loses control over the land he's proudest of, the alliance corners him at the gate of the Black Sea. This is the shot the Kremlin least wants to see. And this is a new act in a centuries-old story. Russia and the Ottomans fought roughly 12 wars across 4 centuries, largely for control of Crimea and the Black Sea. Now, as Crimea sinks into darkness, that centuries-old balance is shifting again. and the gate to the sea remains in Turkey's, that is, NATO's, hands. The blackout in Crimea isn't merely a civilian tragedy. It's a marker of the Black Sea's balance tilting from Moscow toward Ankara. Crimea, and now the question on everyone's mind, touches the greatest taboo. By some observers, including Russian journalist Michael Nucky, even that sole land link tying Crimea to Russia, the Kerch Bridge, could itself be struck. By these assessments, the peninsula could face a full-scale humanitarian crisis in July. As long as the bridge stands, this remains an escape route. But if it falls too, that escape route could turn overnight into a trap, and Putin could be left with a population he cannot protect, locked inside. So what does this whole picture reveal? By many Western analysts, the real issue for Putin is the erosion of a symbol. Taking Crimea almost without bloodshed in 2014 was the foundation of his image as the leader who brought the empire back. Now, by the assessment of institutions like the Atlantic Council, that greatest victory is under threat, and the peninsula is turning into a place the people he brought are trying to leave. Yet an honest line must be drawn here, because this isn't a one-way collapse story. It doesn't mean Crimea falls tomorrow. Most of the population is still there, the bridge still stands, and by many Western analysts, retaking the peninsula militarily is beyond Ukraine's power for now. So what we're seeing isn't a military collapse, it's more a political and psychological tremor. What's more, a cornered Putin may be not more compliant but more dangerous, expected to take out the pain of Crimea and Belgorod by raining more missiles on Ukrainian cities. Indeed, the United Nations has reported a 40% surge in civilian casualties from Russian air attacks. And it mustn't be forgotten, these strikes affect civilians on both sides. The bill for this war, now past its 4th year, is paid most heavily of all by civilians. In the end, what we're seeing in Crimea isn't the story of a single substation or a single night. It's a domino falling step by step. A darkness triggered by drones costing a few $1,000s rendered water, fuel, money and daily life unlivable across an entire peninsula, collapsed its authority, and the hundreds of thousands Putin settled here over 12 years now ask, behind a single bridge, "Can I get out before this last door closes too?" And that darkness is no longer Crimea's alone. It's Belgorod's, the Black Sea's, and increasingly Russia's own. This was a leader's greatest fear, his loss of control, laid bare for all to see. Even if the peninsula doesn't fall tomorrow, that promise of ours forever, at least this summer, has already been plunged into darkness.
And we have video confirmation for every single one of them.
Ukrainian President Zelensky literally brought the house down with his impact, delivering a powerful speech that united NATO at the summit in Ankara. Just look at the difference the moment Zelensky arrived in Turkey. Zelensky's resolute stance reveals just how much the events unfolding after his heated debate with Trump at the White House have changed the current landscape against Russia. We will share with you what happened during Zelensky's speech, where he detailed how approximately 28,000 Russian soldiers were neutralized by Ukrainian troops in combat in June alone. He says,
"In June alone, nearly 28,000 Russian soldiers were eliminated, and we have video confirmation for every single one of them. The overwhelming majority were struck by drones. And frankly, we take no pride in this. We are saying it to show what modern war looks like, a war we did not start, but one we are forced to fight."
Zelensky continues his speech by addressing the notion that Russia's rear echelon is protected and defended. Zelensky states that this notion has now completely vanished. They no longer have a strategic rear. Our drones, what Zelensky calls long-range sanctions, have been highly effective in targeting Russian infrastructure abroad. Let's look at another part of the speech, where Zelensky says,
"In the meantime, we have completely eliminated the very idea of Russia having a strategic rear. And you know this country. And for a long time, Russia believed it had a territorial advantage. No one else possessed a deep rear. where it could safely keep military production, military equipment, and everything its war depends on, believing no one could reach them. And we have reached them. Just yesterday, Ukrainian drones broke through Russia's defenses and struck a Russian oil refinery in Siberia. And this is not an exception. It's the new reality. And there is no major oil refinery left in Russia that has not been struck by Ukraine.
There is more from Zelensky here. He also talks about the defense aspect. Ukraine can defend against Russian drone swarms and even some Russian cruise missiles, but it truly struggles with Russian ballistic missiles. Because for that, you desperately need Patriot interceptors. This is what Zelensky is drawing attention to here. Let's see what Zelensky said regarding this.
And today we defend against hundreds of attacks drones every day and night, and thousands every week and every month. Ukraine's defense sector is building that capability even in the middle of a full-scale war. And we also maintain a high interception rate against cruise missiles, thanks to the way we have built our air defense. And thanks to the support of all of our partners who continue to provide Ukraine with defense assistance. Thank you so much. And I have a question for you. Do you really believe it? Do you really believe it would be right to live outside NATO, a country and a people with this level of defensive capability?
Zelensky then continues, but look, there are areas where we want to help NATO. How interesting, isn't it? Donald Trump spends his time there attacking NATO. Meanwhile, Zelensky says,
today, because of this, Ukraine has the world's largest and the most advanced drone warfare capability. And we are offering this capability to our partners through the Drone Deal initiative.
Then, in one part of his speech, he says,
unlike Putin, we are not fighting this war for pleasure or for geopolitics. Russia brought this war to Ukraine, and it's killing our people. It wants to destroy our independence, and we are only defending. From the first day of this war, we are defending ourselves.
That's exactly what he says. And the most staggering decision to emerge from the summit, driven by the impact of Zelensky and the leaders supporting Ukraine, is this. NATO leaders, led by the US, explicitly supported Ukraine's long-range strikes deep into Russia, meaning a kind of green light was given to Kyiv to strike into the very depths of Russia. And that's exactly where the contradiction begins. Putin speaks of victory on screen, but even inside Russia, not everyone believes that narrative anymore. In footage circulating online, a pro-war Russian Duma member, a name from the Defense Committee, was asked, "So why aren't you fighting at the front yourself?" And, losing his temper, stormed out of the interview. A single video, of course, doesn't represent the whole Duma, but it shows that even within the Kremlin's own circle, a "we've lost" psychology is seeping in, and that increasingly, a perception is spreading that Russia can no longer win this war, while the shift in Ankara will only strengthen Ukraine's hand further. But there's another side to the coin. At that same summit, Trump berates his allies. Ukraine still doesn't get the one thing it wants most, membership. And while victory is being discussed at the table, Russia keeps bombing Kyiv. So what did Ankara really change? For Putin, Ukraine, and NATO? 3 actors, 3 separate stories, and we'll look at all of them, step by step, without taking sides. But first, a small favor. Independent war and technology analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd want it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that. It takes only a few seconds. First, let's get clear on what actually happened. The summit ended on Wednesday, July 8th, and Rutte's closing message was summed up in a single line. NATO delivers. Its meaning, defense investment is rising, new capabilities are coming, industrial production is expanding, and Europe and Canada are taking on the larger share of the security burden. Rutte called this NATO 3.0 and rebalancing our security for the better. The official Ankara declaration highlighted two things. The alliance's Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all, was reaffirmed, and Russia was explicitly defined as a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Rutte's NATO 3.0 analogy isn't idle either. The alliance's first incarnation was a deterrence bloc built against the Soviet threat of the Cold War. Its second was an expeditionary force reaching distant theaters like Afghanistan after 9/11. Its third is something else entirely, an alliance shifting to a permanent war economy, placing production and resilience at its center, its weight steadily moving from America to Europe. Ankara was the formal proclamation of this third era. So the summit, on one hand, declared a burden sharing at home, and on the other pointed to a clear threat address abroad. But the real story is in the numbers beneath that framing. Because in Ankara, the concrete decisions came with numbers. According to Al Jazeera, the defense spending target is 5% of GDP by 2035. Europe and Canada raised their core defense investment by more than $139 billion in 2025, a jump of about 20%. The US still spends 3.17% of its GDP, while the Europe and Canada average rose in a single year from 2.3% to 2.53%. The second number is in industry. At the Defense Industry Forum, new procurement deals worth more than 50 billion euros were signed. The third is in the air. A program called Drone Edge earmarks $40 billion for unmanned systems over 5 years, will train 5 times as many drone operators by the end of 2027, and is acquiring systems like the Triton and GlobalEye. And the fourth, the least discussed but perhaps the most strategic, a €27 billion investment to modernize fuel storage and distribution infrastructure and extend new pipelines to the eastern flank. The political meaning of this jump is also big. Europe was criticized for years for free riding, dumping the bill for its defense on America. This $139 billion increase reverses that criticism for the first time. Even if the continent is still behind the US in percentage terms, in absolute figures, it is now starting to seriously pay the cost of its own security. Even so, this won't happen overnight. The 5% target points to 2035, meaning the real burden is spread across the coming decade. What Ankara declared is not an arrival, but the start of a long and costly climb. These 4 numbers all point in one direction. The alliance is declaring not a temporary measure, but a permanent military-industrial mobilization. Now to the first question. What does all this mean for Russia and Putin? The answer runs 2 ways. On one hand, Moscow is directly in the crosshairs, because beyond being declared a long-term threat in the declaration, those 2 big decisions target precisely Russia's 2 strongest cards. The fuel pipelines reaching the eastern flank against Russia's energy and logistics leverage, and the $40 billion drone program against Russia's drone superiority. Combined with that long-range strike backing we mentioned in the opening, the picture sharpens. Russia's energy card, its drone edge, and the invulnerability of its depth are all being tested at once. That Russia no longer has a strategic depth claim we saw in the opening also has a technical counterpart. Ukraine has tools like the FP-1 long-range drone, which can reach up to 3,400 kilometers, and the ballistic-tipped FP-5. This range is the very lever carrying the war into the regions Russia thought safest. But the other side of the coin must be seen too. The Kremlin did not back down. Spokesman Peskov said they were closely following the summit, that the statements beforehand were confrontational, not constructive, but added that Russia remains open to dialogue. Peskov also branded Ukraine's strikes on tankers and energy infrastructure as terrorism against the international energy system. There's a critical nuance here. This terrorism label is Russia's position. Ukraine and the West, by contrast, see the same strikes as legitimate military targets that finance the war. Another of Peskov's warnings touched the nuclear dimension. He said that the Baltic states opening the door to nuclear weapons deployment, following Finland, would not increase their security and would force Russia to take countermeasures. So the Kremlin turns every new step on the eastern flank into a pretext for escalation. And there's an opportunity window in the picture too. Trump is keeping the peace track alive, spoke with Putin by phone over the weekend, and said a solution is closer than thought. So for Moscow, the outlook is two-sided. On one side, a hardening alliance. On the other, a negotiation door still left ajar through the US. There's actually a paradox here. The same Trump who arms Ukraine with one hand, through Europe, is phoning Putin with the other. This duality unsettles Kyiv, the fear of a deal being imposed over their heads, and puzzles his allies. While the alliance declares Russia a threat, the alliance's most powerful member praises peace. And what most bothers Putin is that the pressure doesn't come from a single place. Ankara's decisions are part of a picture squeezing Russia from three directions at once. A Russia losing naval dominance in the Black Sea, with the alliance's ring tightening to its west and north, while at home it wrestles with the war's economic bill. The summit took decisions that deepen all three of these fronts. Still, the picture isn't entirely dark for Moscow. That negotiation door Trump keeps open could offer Russia a way out, an easing of sanctions, a freezing of the front line where it stands, or time to regroup. So the Kremlin, even as it's being encircled, may try to use this window as a lever. A quick break. Liking, a one-word comment, and subscribing directly help this video reach far more people, because we're now moving to the second question: what this summit really means for Ukraine. Second question: what did Ukraine gain, and what did it not get? The gains are big. On money, according to Kyiv Post, the Allies pledged €70 billion for 2026, and at least an equal amount for 2027. Roughly €140 billion over 2 years. But an honest nuance is essential here. This isn't all new money. It includes existing bilateral programs and the European Union's €90 billion Ukraine loan, and the pledge covers 31 allies. Because the US, with Trump, has halted direct military donations. The bargaining behind this figure wasn't smooth either. While German Chancellor Merz pushed for a fixed and binding number, Italy at first opposed the 2-year commitment. So, the €140 billion headline is a fragile mosaic, its pieces coming from different capitals and still under debate. The second gain is in status. Ukraine is now recognized not merely as an aid recipient, but as a country that contributes to the alliance's security, thanks to its leap in drone warfare, frontline innovation, and defense production. This means the end of a one-way aid relationship. What Ukraine has learned at the front, unmanned systems, electronic warfare, rapid mass production, is now becoming a living laboratory in which NATO updates its own doctrine. Zelensky put a concrete number on it too. He said that in June alone, roughly 28,000 Russian soldiers were neutralized, each confirmed on video by drones, adding, "We take no pride in this. We're showing what modern war looks like." This figure belongs to Ukraine and is not independently verified. Concrete deals came too. In Ankara, Zelensky signed drone agreements with Estonia, the Netherlands, and Denmark. More are expected with Germany, Norway, Finland, and Canada. Ukraine is in drone production talks with 15 NATO countries. In his words, a drone deal initiative. Not just buying drones, but cooperating on co-production and critical infrastructure defense. On air defense, Zelensky's #1 request was Patriot missiles. Trump said the US would show Ukraine a Patriot production license, and 9 European countries are trying to fund Patriots for Ukraine through that €90 billion package. So what was missing? In one word, membership. Even though Zelensky said Ukraine belongs in NATO, membership was not granted. According to a RUSI expert, membership wasn't even on the table. On a security guarantee too, Trump stayed vague, saying only that if there's a deal, they'd work on a security package. That condition itself is telling. A guarantee you'd get only if you make peace also becomes a lever pushing Ukraine toward the table. So the assurance is both a reward and a means of pressure. In other words, Ukraine came away with its hands full, but without the thing it wanted most. Zelensky put this gap on the table with a question. Is it really right for a country and a people with this level of defensive capability to live outside NATO? And he contrasted himself with Putin. We're not fighting for pleasure or geopolitics, but to defend ourselves. Putin, on the other hand, wants to seize Ukraine and revive a Russian empire. This was not merely a bargain over aid, but also a claim to legitimacy. Third question. What does all this mean for NATO itself? Two things are happening at once. First, the rebalancing we call NATO 3.0. As the US pulls back its weight, Europe and Canada take over the larger share, and the focus shifts, in Rutte's phrase, from setting targets to delivering results. Europe is filling the gap concretely. 5 NATO countries signed a historic deal to build a facility producing the Patriot PAC-3 missile on the continent's own soil. Zelensky underlined this too. Europe urgently needs its own anti-ballistic production capacity because top-tier air defense still depends on the US-made Patriot. In short, the continent is taking a step towards strategic autonomy. Zelensky put numbers to this dependence too. Today's Patriot production falls far short of meeting the rising ballistic missile threat. Those who defend life need more Patriots, he said. The continent's rush to build its own production line is born precisely of this gap. But this picture of strengthening isn't crack-free, and that's the second reality. According to Al Jazeera, at the summit, Trump declared Spain a terrible ally. Pressed on with his Greenland insistence, Denmark replied, "It's not for sale," and said he was very unhappy with NATO for getting no help in the Iran war, even implying he attended the summit out of respect for Erdogan. So while the alliance grows stronger against the outside, at home it's facing a serious test of trust. Trump's own words made this test even more concrete. He said the Ukraine war doesn't affect the US. Biden gave hundreds of billions of dollars worth of equipment for free. I, on the other hand, sell it, and not to Ukraine, but to the European Union. They pay for it. He hinted he could pull all his troops out of Europe if needed, and issued the continent a blunt warning. If they're not careful about immigration and energy, there may not be a Europe left. So the alliance's greatest strength is also its greatest uncertainty. And it's right here that the host, Turkey, came to the fore. According to Reuters, Trump announced he would lift the sanctions on Turkey and said he'd put F-35 sales back on the table, a move reversing years of tension born of Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system. Trump described the relationship as better than ever. For the host country, which has one of the eastern flank's largest armies, this became one of the summit's most concrete outcomes. The reopening of the F-35 door is, for Turkey, not just a matter of an aircraft. It means a return to the 5th-generation fighter program it was long shut out of, and a reseating at the center of the Western defense architecture. A Turkey that hosted the summit and can talk to both Russia and the West is a bridge in this picture. And that bridge position gives Ankara bargaining power that strengthens its hand both within NATO and at the table. But while all these numbers and declarations were discussed in Ankara, one thing didn't stop: the war itself. As the summit went on, Russia kept striking Ukraine. According to Al Jazeera, a missile attack on Kyiv on July 8th killed at least 3 people and wounded 14. A few days earlier, on July 6th, 23 ballistic missiles hit the capital, and more than 20 civilians died in the Vyshnev suburb. The war didn't stop for declarations, and the bill for this war, in a way no figure on the table can offset, is paid most heavily again by civilians. Zelensky came to the summit far stronger than a year ago. In Bloomberg's phrasing, thanks to the refinery strikes, European funding, and a recovery at the front. But Ukraine still suffers a shortage of Patriot interceptor missiles, and Russia continues its incremental advance in the east. So the equation on the ground is far more complicated than Ankara's bright picture. In fact, Ukraine's real gap is precisely here. On offense, in drones, in deep strikes, Ukraine is one of the world's most advanced militaries. But on defense, especially against Russian ballistic missiles, it still depends on US-made Patriot interceptors. And those interceptors aren't coming in enough numbers. So on one side, a Ukraine seizing the initiative at the front. On the other, a Ukraine that can't fully protect its own skies. This is the real equation the summit didn't solve. And this equation has a human face too. While leaders shook hands in Ankara, in those same hours, families in Kyiv were pulling their loved ones from the rubble. That distance between the abstract figures at the table and the concrete pain on the street remains the most harrowing aspect of this war. So, Putting all this side by side, what did Ankara really declare? On paper, it was a strong summit. NATO 3.0, 140 billion euros, a contributing Ukraine, pipelines reaching east, a huge drone program. But the nuances matter at least as much as the headlines. Not all of that 140 billion euros is new money. Ukraine didn't get the membership it wanted. The security guarantee is vague and conditional on a peace deal. Trump's commitment is a question mark, and Russia neither backed down nor stopped its strikes. In fact, the summit set a different test before each actor. For Russia, the question is, will it reverse this encirclement on the ground or come to the table? For Ukraine, the question is whether it can turn this paper support into real missiles and drones. And for NATO, the question is the hardest. As America steps back, can Europe really fill that gap? None of the three answers has been given yet. For the historical record, in NATO's more than 70-year journey, Ankara may be remembered as the moment the alliance's weight shifted this decisively toward Europe and the East for the first time. But what makes a summit historic is not the decisions it takes, but whether those decisions are kept. The real message is this. Ankara declared not an ending, but a route on which Europe begins to take on its own security, and the war turns into a long, drawn-out industrial race. And the real test of that route will be delivery, not declarations. Will the promised missiles, drones, and pipelines actually reach the field? Because history is usually written not by the promises made at the table, but by the promises kept in the field. So what do you think about all this? This fuel shortage didn't fall from the sky. There's a very clear strategy behind it. Since August 2025, Kyiv has run a systematic drone campaign against Russian refineries. Uncrewed aircraft with ranges of hundreds, even thousands of kilometers, strike refineries across the country one by one. The aim is to dry up, at the same time, the oil revenue that feeds Russia's war economy and the fuel that keeps its army standing. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Syrsky sums up the strategy in a single line. This is a fuel crisis that strikes directly at the Russian army's logistics and resupply. But here's what matters. This time, Ukraine went after the exit point of the very sea route that feeds Kaliningrad. In early June, Ukrainian drones struck one of the Baltic's largest oil terminals, the massive terminal in St. Petersburg, hours before the opening of the economic forum known as Putin's Davos. Black smoke rose over the city. In those same days, the Baltic Fleet base at Kronstadt and nearby naval arsenals were hit too. A Russian missile corvette escorting the shadow oil fleet, the Boyki, even took a blow in dry dock. So both the port the fuel leaves from and the escort of the fleet that carries that fuel past sanctions were shaken at once. The irony, while Russian officials at the forum called the strikes a total failure, satellite imagery plainly showed the damage at the terminal and hours of that thick smoke. And it wasn't a one-off. In early July, drones came down on the same area once more. The port and oil terminal around St. Petersburg were struck again. The pressure is constant, landing on the same spot over and over. Since the region's fuel comes through this very port, every time Ukraine hits it, it cuts the line feeding Kaliningrad at the source. Without entering a frontline battle at all, it dries the region out slowly. And there's a fresh threat on top. A 40-day summer deep strike campaign has just begun, and as drone range grows, that thin sea lane to Kaliningrad grows riskier by the day. Both sides pay the bill at once, the civilian public and the army alike. On the civilian side, the problem runs far deeper than a fuel tank. Kaliningrad's dependence on fuel isn't limited to vehicles. Heating systems, power generation, and industrial plants all rest on the same source. It isn't hard to picture what this scarcity means when winter heating demand peaks. Cold homes, stalled production, cascading outages. The region's roughly 1 million population carries that weight directly. Families wait in line for hours, public transport falters, tourism takes a hit. The military side is even more striking. Tens of thousands of Russian troops are stationed in the region. The Baltic Fleet's sea patrols, training flights, and logistics vehicles all depend directly on fuel. Restrict the fuel and ship movement, vehicle upkeep, and unit readiness all falter. The Baltic Fleet, with hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of personnel, is one of Russia's most established naval forces. But even the most modern ship can't leave port on an empty tank. This base's real purpose was to turn the Baltic skies into an anti-access area denial bubble for Russia. But if even the generators feeding its radars and missile systems need that same fuel, the strength of that bubble comes into question too. Deterrence only counts as long as you can move. When the fuel runs out, all that's left is an anchored show of force. This isolation has an unseen human dimension too. Kaliningrad's distinct identity. This place sits 663 kilometers from Moscow by geography, but Warsaw, Vilnius, even Berlin are far closer to it than mainland Russia. The fabric of the city says the same. Kant's grave, the restored Königsberg Cathedral, German-era buildings. Western and Russian scholars have long debated a Königsberg identity here, a strand of belonging that leans toward Europe, distinct from Moscow. And the Kremlin is plainly uneasy about that identity. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov voiced this discomfort back in 2021 in Kaliningrad, saying, "Some foreign partners are trying to instill a so-called Königsberg identity." Around the same period, the region's long-standing German-Russian house was declared a foreign agent and shut down. Pro-Kremlin media warned of academic separatism and creeping Germanization at the university, and one academic's contract was not renewed. When a state is this uneasy about its own region's identity, that identity is truly there. So does the public really say, "We're European, let's leave"? Here, honesty is needed, because the picture is more tangled than it looks. By a field study, the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Ethnology ran in 2023 across 11 cities with more than 1,500 people, the region's population on the whole carries a strong Russian identity and a sense of belonging to a larger country. The majority has no plans to leave. But the same study shows a critical crack too. A significant share of young people want to move elsewhere. What stands out? Most of these young people are eyeing not Europe, but Moscow and St. Petersburg, where living standards are higher. So this isn't a flight to Europe wave. It's more the quiet restlessness of a generation seeking its future beyond this isolated corner. And today's crisis deepens that restlessness. Back in February 2025, when the Baltic states left the shared Soviet-era power grid, Kaliningrad's electricity was severed from Russia's. The region had to spend an estimated $1 billion to balance the grid internally. So the region was used to having its plug pulled, even before the fuel crisis erupted. Now that fuel, transport, and heating fall under the same pressure, that trapped outpost feeling grows heavier, especially for young people looking for a way out. This is neither a revolt nor a rupture, but it's a quiet sign that the people at an empire's westernmost edge are being squeezed inside a steadily narrowing circle. So, Kaliningrad's meaning has shifted at the root too. Once it was Russia's pride in the Baltic, its forward outpost, the symbol of its deterrence. Today, it's a burden that grows harder to carry and swallows resources. NATO states watch this picture closely, as Poland and Lithuania keep up transit restrictions and step up exercises and force build-ups in border areas. The region's isolation deepens further. What's more, the Baltic Sea is now almost a NATO lake. Nearly all of its coastal states are alliance members. So that sea lane feeding Kaliningrad is turning into a far harder route to defend in the future. And this isn't being tested for the first time. Those same transit restrictions caused a full-blown crisis in 2022. Nearly half the cargo was suspended, and as Moscow hurled threats of retaliation, shelves in Kaliningrad emptied in panic. That crisis was resolved at the table, through diplomacy. But today's difference is exactly the point. The issue is no longer a negotiable list of sanctions, but a fuel line that can be quietly targeted from afar. And reopening that at the table isn't so easy. A local administration turning to the Kremlin is itself a sign of lost control. As public discontent grows, Russia's strong state image cracks in the Baltic. The strategic lesson of this picture is far bigger. To bring an entire region to its knees, you no longer need to occupy it or march an army in. Cutting the supply line that feeds it is enough. Low cost and high impact, This approach calls even classic war doctrines into question and will likely serve as a model for future conflicts. Kaliningrad is the most concrete symbol of this new form of warfare. One of the most fortified regions on Earth is cornered without a single clash on its borders, simply because its arteries were cut. A modern fortress's strength is no longer measured by the thickness of its walls, but by the security of its supply line. The bottom line: Russia's most powerful fortress in the Baltic is now scrambling to find fuel for its own vehicles. What's forcing it isn't tanks massed at its border or enemy fleets. It's an empty fuel tank and a sea lane that can be cut. This is an unusual cry for help from an empire's most distant edge, and it whispers a far larger truth. To shake an empire, you don't always have to defeat its army. Sometimes it's enough to cut the fuel that keeps it standing. Still, an honest line is needed. This doesn't mean Kaliningrad surrenders tomorrow. Putin approved the additional shipments, the ferry and air bridge are in play, and the region is still Russian soil. What we're seeing isn't a military collapse, it's economic and psychological erosion. And the heaviest bill, once again, is paid by civilians. Homes that can't be heated, a costlier life, hours in line. In this war now past its fourth year, the price is paid most of all by ordinary people on both sides. With the coming summer campaign, the picture could grow heavier still. That thin sea route grows more fragile by the day. An empire's strength is often measured not by how far it pushes its borders, but by whether it can feed its own forward outpost. And Kaliningrad is being tested on exactly that today. Putin's fist in the Baltic is knotted around its own fuel tank. So, what's your take? Can Russia keep this lonely fortress standing, or will Kaliningrad become a turning point in the Baltic? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay up to date with PPR's exclusive war and technology analysis, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us. The peninsula can no longer benefit from neighboring countries' surplus electricity production in emergencies. Lithuanian authorities took this diplomatic rupture one step further with a harsh physical move. All high-voltage electricity transmission lines located at the Kaliningrad border were systematically dismantled. No equipment was left to enable energy transfer between the two regions. This liquidation operation on the border lines literally transformed the Exclave into an isolated energy island. The regional administration was forced to turn to its own internal facilities to meet local needs. 3 natural gas cycle power plants named Pregolskaya, Mayakovskaya, and Talakovskaya are currently trying to carry the grid's load. In addition, the Primorskaya coal plant is being kept on standby as backup power. On paper, Russia creates a confidence illusion by claiming it has raised the region's installed capacity to twice the peak consumption hours. Facilities having massive capacities does not mean anything by itself. An uninterrupted natural gas or LNG flow is needed for those turbines to keep turning continuously. The biggest dilemma of the local energy architecture begins at exactly this point. 2 main options exist for supplying gas to the region. The first is the traditional overland pipeline passing through Lithuanian territory. This transit passage has already been largely restricted within the scope of existing sanctions. The risk of valves being completely shut in a potential diplomatic crisis sits on the table. The second and most vital option is the sea route. The floating LNG terminal named Marshal Vasilevsky, positioned on the shores, is the city's ultimate energy insurance. Evaluated with a mathematical approach, hospital life support units, water purification pumps, central heating boilers, in short, 1 million people not being plunged into darkness, is tied to clumsy LNG ships that will come by sea. The tragicomic aspect is that the Baltic waters these ships must pass through have already ceased to be a safe route. Ukrainian elements have long started hunting shadow fleet tankers used to circumvent sanctions on the open seas. Boyki-class warships tasked with ensuring security in regional waters were struck while defenseless in their own dry docks, rendering them inoperable. In the airspace, the Western Alliance's overwhelming superiority is visible. Jets belonging to the French Air Force intercepted a full 11 Russian military aircraft flying over the Baltics in just 1 week, removing them from the airspace. This situation is being recorded as the most intense engagement series observed in the region since 2022. This security vulnerability at sea found immediate response in global insurance markets. Hull and war risk insurance premiums demanded for civilian Russian tankers operating in the Baltic Sea have practically skyrocketed to the stratosphere. Feeding the city with fuel by sea is turning not only into a military suicide, but also into an unsustainable massive black hole for the Kremlin economy. You do not need to pound distant power plants with ballistic missiles to plunge a metropolis into darkness. Cutting the fuel chain feeding those plants' boilers in the middle of the sea achieves reaching the target on its own. The lifelight of Kaliningrad's people has been left at the mercy of this invisible blockade that narrows with each passing day. Empty threats hurled at diplomatic tables, when they cannot find strong logistical footholds on the ground, become a strategic noose that will strangle their owner. When we look at the map with a broader vision, we see that the military ring around Kaliningrad is tightening a little more each day. 9 NATO countries surrounding the peninsula are locking the region with unprecedented coordination. This circle, consisting of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Germany, is positioned to cut the Exclave's breathing tube. Finland and Sweden's joining of the alliance effectively transformed the Baltic region into an allied lake. The strategically important island of Gotland was fortified with heavy weapons. Swedish Gripen fighter jets conducted emergency intercept takeoffs twice in a single day, proving that Russian aviation can no longer fly uncontrollably in these waters. The siege strategy is not limited to just sea and airspace. Ground elements are also displaying extremely aggressive deterrence. In mid-June, the armies of Lithuania, Poland and France launched a massive military exercise called Brave Boar 2026. The exercise's central base was chosen as the 65-kilometer Suwałki corridor, Kaliningrad's only potential land connection extending to Belarusian territory. Under the leadership of Poland's 16th Pomeranian Mechanized Division, thousands of Allied soldiers are practicing the rapid defense of this narrow strip. The message delivered to Moscow from the field is extremely clear. Alliance forces have the capacity to cut this land connection within seconds in any aggression scenario. Simultaneously, Baltop's 2026 naval maneuvers continue at full speed. Tens of thousands of personnel are waiting positioned in the region. The heaviest component of this tightening ring is undoubtedly Poland. The Warsaw administration upended the technological balance on the eastern flank with the 32 F-35A stealth aircraft it newly added to its fleet. Advanced fifth-generation aircraft have the ability to operate well below the detection threshold of S-400 batteries in Kaliningrad. 700 kilometers of concrete fortifications are being laid along the border lines. Estonia activated Europe's first comprehensive anti-drone shield by building electronic walls. Alliance forces shot down a Russian reconnaissance drone that had lost control in Latvian airspace for the first time in history, slamming it mercilessly to the ground. Germany-based Diehl Defense Company is taking steps to produce Flamingo cruise missiles with 3,000-kilometer range to close the missile gap in the region. This range carries the potential to place the garrison in a ring of fire from every direction. Behind all this steel siege lies a massive tactical transformation. The Baltic states learned this defense and isolation concept they apply on the ground directly from the Crimea laboratory. And to materialize the risk Kaliningrad faces, there is no need to look far. Looking at Crimea is sufficient. Because the logistics lockdown strategy Ukraine is currently applying in Crimea is writing the most realistic scenario for Kaliningrad's future in real time. What is happening in Crimea in June 2026? Ukraine's unmanned systems forces are systematically striking all bridges leading to the peninsula. Chonhar has been targeted at least 4 times. Military cargo traffic on the R280 highway dropped by 71%. Fuel convoys are burning on roadsides from drone attacks. Gasoline queues in Sevastopol are growing. Rationing has started. Air defense systems are being struck in succession, creating a vicious cycle. As defense weakens, drones strike more easily, and as they strike, defense erodes further. The Black Sea Fleet Command is planning to abandon Sevastopol and move to Novorossiysk. Officers are secretly fleeing the peninsula with their families. Real estate prices are dropping, morale is collapsing. And Ukraine is doing all of this without sending a single ground force. The structural similarities between Crimea and Kaliningrad are frighteningly parallel. Neither is directly connected to the mainland by land. Both are being resupplied by sea. In both, large military garrisons and civilian populations live together. Both have energy supplies dependent on external sources. In Crimea, fuel is running out. In Kaliningrad, fuel comes from the same sea line, and that line's exit ports are burning. In Crimea, air defense is being breached. In Kaliningrad, the S-400s fall below the detection threshold of F-35s. Ukraine is testing the logistics lockdown doctrine in Crimea in real time, and this test offers an invaluable sample for the West's Kaliningrad scenario. How to declare a bridge with drones, how to cut a fuel line, how to create a vicious cycle in air defense, how to break the morale of the command echelon. All of these are being written live in Crimea, and the results are directly applicable to Kaliningrad. NATO planners are not ignoring this lesson. And when all the measures and moves made so far come together, the picture that emerges can be read as Kaliningrad's invisible siege. A classic blockade would require a navy, would require a declaration of war, would be visible. This new siege is invisible, a strategy targeting every port, every refinery, every sea line feeding Kaliningrad from thousands of kilometers away, manipulating insurance markets and using energy dependency as a weapon. And the actors watching this strategy most carefully are not just Moscow. Beijing and New Delhi are also following this picture closely. How an exclave or island, for example Taiwan, can be suffocated with an invisible siege by simply cutting supply lines without a military landing is being shown live in Crimea, while the next scene is being prepared in Kaliningrad. Crimea's today is the clearest warning about Kaliningrad's tomorrow, and this warning is directly applicable to both the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. For years, Kaliningrad was seen as the fortress from which Russia threatened Europe. But that fortress's walls are no longer protecting it, they are besieging it. The sea line's exit ports are burning, ammunition depots are turning to ash, electricity lines have been dismantled, the gas pipeline is